Chapter 830. Even with Mr. Nian's composure, he could not help feeling a pang in his heart when he spoke of this. Back then, He Hanqing thought that the 9 Supremes must be the kind of people who kept a low profile. Since only one of them had returned for revenge, they would naturally be more cautious and would not show themselves easily. Therefore, those who were ostentatious and domineering on the surface should not be part of the investigation, especially great young Master Yun, who had the famous nickname of Good-for-Nothing. As the saying goes, a person's name is often wrong, but his nickname will never be wrong. Even I, the esteemed one, agree with this saying. This is human nature after all, and it's completely understandable. However, never would I have thought that it was this tiny bit of negligence, this tiny bit of assumption, that caused the Four Seasons Tower to commit the greatest mistake. Mr. Nian shook his head and smiled bitterly. Yun Yang smiled faintly as well. There was an inexplicable coldness in his smile. Thinking back to that time, most of the other 9 Supremes' brothers' identities had indeed been low-key. Only he and 8th brother had done the exact opposite, hiding in the imperial court and shielding themselves from the public's eyes and ears. He did not expect that it was this that had saved his life. Good-for-nothing. It was such a distant nickname. He did not expect that the after-effect of the battle that day would be a protective talisman that he was unaware of. This should be an unfunny joke. However, this joke is unusually fatal. With this mistake as the beginning, the second and third investigations were all done to eliminate you guys first, then work on the others. Yun Yang did not know whether to laugh or cry. Come to think of it, this should be the case. After the first investigation, who would work on those who had been eliminated and confirmed to be not the 9 Supremes? This was something that no one would do. Unless they had done it countless times and confirmed that this method could not be found, only then would they turn around and revise the direction. However, He Hanqing obviously did not wait for this moment. Later on, there were people who suggested a new investigation. When the venerable lords came into contact with you, they could clearly feel that you were different from the others. You were unusually active and your ability grew at an alarming rate. However, your relationship with Ling Xiaozue was revealed. Yun Yang sighed. There was a bitter smile on Mr. Nian's face. The appearance of Ling Xiaozue, the ultimate weapon, is the best chance to pull you, Supreme Cloud, out of the picture. It's just one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to provoke Ling Xiaozue, the unrivaled expert. After all, when the Four Seasons Tower's survival is at stake, a strong enemy like Ling Xiaozue would naturally be unwilling to provoke him. On the other hand, you credited Ling Xiaozue for the huge improvement in your cultivation base. After all, with Ling Xiaozue's ability, it wouldn't be strange for your ability to improve tremendously in a short amount of time if he were to be close to you. On the contrary, it's only natural. Now that I think about it, Ling Xiaozue's ability is unfathomable, but his wealth is very limited. It's not easy to groom a young expert in such a short amount of time. It's a shame that the Four Seasons Tower was blind, completely ignoring such a huge flaw. Instead, they found excuses for all of you and let it go, coming to such a logical conclusion. It really makes me feel helpless. After that, your name appeared several times in my line of sight, like the battle between the 4 Venerable Ones and the battle between you and the boy from the other world, like how you rushed to the Fortress of Resilience alone to provide aid. Everything is still vivid in my mind, but I always missed it because of such a reason. If time could be reversed, I would kill Supreme Lord Springfrost, He Hanqing, 100 times over with my own hands. Mr. Nian smiled faintly, but the menacing meaning in his words was clear. He lifted his head to look at He Hanqing. An investigation like this is equivalent to He Hanqing sending the entire Four Seasons Tower's power to your butcher's knife. Otherwise, everything would have ended a long time ago. Yun Yang said leisurely, if time could be reversed, I would definitely have a drink with old Master Wenzong. He has protected Yutong his entire life, sparing no effort in doing so. Mr. Nian chuckled coldly. He was so choked by the words that he almost did not want to continue. Of course, there's another point that leaves no room for doubt on your side. You've never shown any signs of anyone obeying your orders. As everyone knows, the 9 Supremes have to mobilize the 9 Heavens Dictum's power, but that mysterious force has obviously made a move. This proves that Supreme Cloud has been manipulating its movements all along, proving your innocence. However, every time it makes a move, you, Yun-yang, have done nothing at all. You haven't even seen a stranger. Come to think of it, this must be another layer of concealment that you've prepared. Regarding this, Mr. Nian has overestimated me. It's a pity that Mr. Nian has never entered the residence of 9 Supremes. Yun-yang said faintly, there's a strange existence called the 9 Heavens Dictum in the residence of 9 Supremes. This is the key that allows me to control the force that the 9 Heavens Dictum belongs to. Mr. Nian's expression turned serious. Oh. The 9 Heavens Dictum is the name of the organization under the 9 Supremes that everyone knows. However, to me, it's a token. Through this token, I can command the 9 Heavens Dictum to do anything, even from thousands of miles away. Yun-yang said slowly, therefore, judging whether I'm Supreme Cloud or not based on my connection with the 9 Heavens Dictum, the answer is destined to be wrong. This has been a false proposition from the very beginning. It's a pity that it's not a crime of war. Mr. Nian's expression, which had been calm since the beginning of the conversation, finally changed. There's actually such a thing? There's actually such a magical thing in this world? Yun-yang smiled. Perhaps Mr. Nian doesn't believe it, but the truth is, even the people under the 9 Heavens Dictum don't know who Supreme Cloud is or who Supreme Cloud's true identity is. From the beginning to the end, there's only one thing that can be confirmed, other than the 9 Supremes' unique cultivation method, no one else can use the 9 Heavens Dictum to send messages. Therefore, the one who sent the message must be one of the 9 Supremes. Mr. Nian was stunned for a long time before he finally chuckled bitterly. I see. It's not too unjust for the 4 Seasons Tower to lose the intelligence war. It's indeed a crime of war. Yun-yang smiled faintly and did not comment further. Mr. Nian's meaning was clear. In this era where fast horses and flying birds were still required to send messages, something that defied common sense and could be transmitted thousands of miles away had actually appeared. While everyone was staring at the communication channel, someone else had completed his task from tens of thousands of miles away. It would be strange if he did not lose under such circumstances. This is one of the core secrets of the residence of 9 Supremes. Yun-yang said, does Mr. Nian want to know any other secrets of the residence of 9 Supremes? Mr. Nian sighed softly. If Lord Supreme Cloud is willing to tell me, of course, I'm more than willing to listen and broaden my horizons. Looking at the graceful Mr. Nian, Yun-yang sighed softly and said, Sir, your demeanor and bearing are indeed extraordinary. It reminds me of a saying. Mr. Nian smiled faintly. You are a beauty, but why have you become a thief? That's right, that's right. Sir, you know me well. Mr. Nian smiled and said, what is an official? What is a thief? Yun-yang was silent. Finally, he smiled. Yes. We are friends of life and death because our standpoints are different. That's right. We are friends of life and death because our standpoints are different. Mr. Nian sighed softly. Chapter 831. Lord Supreme Cloud's explanation has enlightened me, but it's this friendship of life and death that has won me over. Mr. Nian smiled. Since we're friends of life and death, we should fight to the death today to end this battle of destiny. If so, why don't you tell me more about the residence of 9 Supreme secrets, Lord Supreme Cloud? I've lived my entire life and I've seen many things, but this is the first time I've encountered something so strange. Yun-yang flashed a mocking smile and said, the secret of the residence of 9 Supremes belongs only to the 9 Supremes. To put it more bluntly, I've mentioned the truth just now. Only the unique cultivation method of the 9 Supremes can activate the secret hidden in the residence of 9 Supremes. Other than the 9 of us, no one else possesses the cultivation method of the 9 Supremes. Therefore, it's useless for Mr. Nian to know about the residence of 9 Supreme secrets, it'll only add to your troubles. There are too many mysteries in this world that are beyond everyone's knowledge. What's the point of forcing it, especially now that the residence of 9 Supremes has disappeared? Mr. Nian's expression changed for the first time. Disappeared? Wasn't it concealed by Lord Supreme Cloud using a secret art and not revealed to anyone? Yunyang smiled and said, I know that Mr. Nian has always coveted the residence of 9 Supremes. But now, it's already too late. Too late? Mr. Nian asked in a daze. Yunyang answered with certainty, it is indeed too late. The residence of 9 Supremes' destiny has come to an end. Such a divine artifact shouldn't stay in the secular world, should it? Besides, our paths are different. Mr. Nian smiled and murmured, different paths, we can't work together. Yunyang said, that's about the residence of 9 Supreme secrets. There's no use in knowing more. It'll only disturb you. Mr. Nian's gaze was cold as he said faintly, no matter what, I've finally solved the greatest mystery that's been in my heart for a long time. I have to thank Lord Supreme Cloud. The 9 Supremes dictum. What a dictum of 9 Supremes. Yunyang picked up the teacup and took a sip. The tea is not bad, he said faintly. Mr. Nian was silent for a moment before he said, it's a pity that the tea is already cold. Yunyang smirked coldly and said, the words have been spoken and the tea has turned cold. Man proposes, but God disposes. God's will is always toying with us. Mr. Nian smiled. Lord Supreme Cloud, I thought you should be brimming with confidence when you took the initiative to propose this challenge. Why are you talking about fate here? With the current situation, it's almost certain that Lord Supreme Cloud has come to this duel of life and death with only 2 people. I don't know if he's blindly believing in heaven's will or if he's underestimating the 4 Seasons Tower. Yunyang's eyes were half-lidded as he said, if Mr. Nian didn't believe in heaven's will, why did he imprison Gu Chaoyang for so many years? During the battle at Tianxian Cliff that day, the 9 Supremes weren't annihilated. Heaven's will has long been clear. This worldly matter, right and wrong, gratitude and resentment will be dealt with from the beginning. It's only right and proper. Mr. Nian replied indifferently, I've understood Lord Supreme White Cloud's intentions since we first met, and it's even more so now. Lord Supreme Cloud is indeed loyal to the country and the people. He is the #1 hero in the world. The so-called heroes are nothing more than this. It's a pity that the 9 Supreme Tea is gone from this world. Mr. Nian sighed with melancholy. The 9 Supremes will cease to exist in this world as well. What a pity. With his arms behind his back, he walked out slowly and said leisurely, Supreme Cloud, there are all the 4 Seasons Tower's top-notch elites on this cliff now. A total of 12 inheritors of God's Bone, the 4 Seasons Tower's brothers for the 12th month. Other than that, there are also the 4 Seasons Messengers of Spring, Summer, Autumn, and Winter. And me, the leader of the 4 Seasons, Nian. The 29 people here are the 4 Seasons Tower's pinnacle combat power, their ultimate force. In other words, if you have the ability to kill all 29 of us here, then there will be no 4 Seasons Tower in the Tianxian continent from now on. Mr. Nian was already at the door. Yunyang asked quietly, there won't be a 4 Seasons Tower in the Tianxian continent? Do you mean that there are other 4 Seasons Towers in other places? Mr. Nian chuckled softly. Perhaps, there really isn't. The Bound of Universe is a place that I've never set foot in. Yunyang did not speak. Mr. Nian's form vanished like a drifting cloud at the door. Since the beginning of time, the 4 seasons of a year have existed forever. How can the 9 Supremes, who appeared by chance, compare to them? Supreme Cloud, focus on preparing for the battle. An hour later, we shall fight to the death and end our grudges. I have no confidence in this battle, but I believe that you, Lord Supreme Cloud, don't have absolute confidence either. However, when it comes to the final resolution, whether it's your soul that wanders into the abyss or my death, neither of us will have any regrets. If you behead me, I hope that you'll toast me and tell me your unspoken secret. If I behead you, I'll toast you as well. His voice faded away. The tea table, teapot, and teacups that were made of flawless jade in the room were abandoned by Mr. Nian just like that, as if they were worthless. Ji Lingxi had not uttered a single word throughout their conversation. It was only now, when she saw Mr. Nian leave and Yunyang sit there in silence, that she could not help saying, "This Mr. Nian, if that's the case, he's worthy of being a dominating figure in the martial arts world. Whether he's good or bad in his actions aside, his demeanor and grace alone are already worthy of being called the pinnacle of this world." Yunyang said in a low voice, "Which one of those who can stir up trouble in the martial world isn't a peerless talent? The 4 Seasons Tower has dominated Tianxuan's martial world for tens of thousands of years. Naturally, they've produced more talents. If Mr. Nian isn't exceptionally talented, how can he be qualified to lead the 4 Seasons Tower? At the end of the day, it's just a grudge caused by different standpoints. However, fate dictates that it's still an unsolvable topic. It's obvious that Mr. Nian and the 4 Seasons Tower must kill me in order to occupy God's grave completely and ascend to the position of God, an unparalleled achievement. I, on the other hand, must uproot the 4 Seasons Tower to avenge my 8 brothers." None of what Mr. Nian said today was a lie. Ji Lingxi said, "I've been monitoring this with the art of frozen heart and telepathy. There's no doubt about it." Yunyang said quietly, "It's expected. Today's battle is a battle of life and death. So-called lies are completely useless at a time like this. Instead of forcefully contending with words, it's better to be sincere and respect this opponent of yours. Respect his own life and death as well. At this moment, he won't lie. Do you have a plan for how to fight after an hour? They have the advantage in numbers." "It's not a lie?" Ji Lingxi asked worriedly. Yunyang chuckled. "What's the use of more people, let alone 29? Fighting until the last person fell was good enough. The reason why I suggested it and Mr. Nian agreed to it is to settle our grudges in the purest manner of the martial world. The final battle this time has to be settled in the martial world's way. The purest manner of the martial world is nothing more than battle and life and death." Chapter 832. An hour was neither short nor long. However, to Fu Baogua and the others who had been waiting below, this period of time felt like a year. An instant felt like a year. Every time the time it took to drink a cup of tea, an incense stick of time, or an instant passed, everyone's hearts were burning with anxiety. Lord Supreme Cloud had been up the mountain for a long time. It had been a long time, but why was there still no movement? What was the situation up there? No matter how confident they were in Lord Supreme Cloud, everyone was still extremely anxious. No one was an exception. Fu Baogua stood there, his anxiety evident. His usual composure and the demeanor of a great general were nowhere to be seen. His demeanor was like that of an ant on a hot pan. He paced back and forth, occasionally raising his head to look up at the mountain, sighing one after another. "How is it? Why is there no movement at all? Since it's a battle between the world's top cultivators, how can it be so silent? Has the battle not started, or is it already over? I heard that a battle between experts happens in the blink of an eye. Could it be?" The generals at the side were also scratching their ears and cheeks. They were so anxious that they wanted to rush up the mountain right now to see what was going on. After a long, long time, "Marshal. Why don't I go up the mountain to see what's going on?" A general said anxiously, I really can't wait any longer. All right. Just as Fu Baogua spoke, before his voice trailed off, all of a sudden, a long howl that shook the sky and shattered the void came from the top of the mountain, carrying with it an unparalleled murderous intent. Mr. Nian, come and fight. It's Lord Supreme Cloud's voice. Fu Baogua stood up excitedly when he heard the voice. The rest of the people's eyes shone as well. They had only heard the voice, but they were already trembling uncontrollably with excitement. Then, an equally violent sound rang out. It was as if a bolt of lightning had ignited a fire in the earth. In an instant, the earth shook and the mountains shook. Everyone was more than 30 miles away, but they could still clearly feel the violent tremors under their feet. Some of the soldiers were even shaken off the ground and fell to the ground again. At the same time, Yun Yang's voice rang out again, Fu Baogua, pull your men back another 30 miles. Yutong's iron-blooded soldiers can't be lost here for nothing. Orders must be obeyed. Fu Baogua's expression was unprecedentedly solemn. He stood up straight and said in a low voice, Yes, sir. Although he was far away and could not see the other party's image, Fu Baogua's actions made it seem like Supreme Cloud was right in front of him. He was as solemn as if he had just received an order. Retreat. Everyone, move. Quick. At that moment, the rumbling sounds from the top of the mountain finally started to ring out. The decisive battle had finally begun. When Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi stepped out of the Temple of Nine Supremes, there were 7 people standing in front of them. All 7 of them were wreathed in murderous intent. The person in the middle was dressed in an elegant green robe, like a bamboo in spring. He was tall and had a thin face, and he held a verdant flute in his hand. There were 6 people beside him, 3 of them were dressed in green, and the other 3 were dressed in yellow. Unlike the leader whose murderous intent was barely visible, these 6 people all wore cold expressions. Their hostility was evident as they pointed at Yun Yang. Lord Supreme Cloud, Spring of the Four Seasons Tower is here to learn from you. The leader in green spoke with a faint smile. His expression was relaxed, as if he had brought a group of good friends for a stroll in spring. How should I address you? Yun Yang asked. Lord Supreme Cloud, you can call me Spring. Spring smiled elegantly. As for the ones beside me, 3 of them are January, February, and March respectively. The other 3 are the Four Seasons Tower's 3 gods' envoys. Lord Supreme Cloud has conversed with our leader for a long time, so you should know who we are. Spring. 3 gods' envoys in one spring, 3 months. Is this the Four Seasons Tower's standard lineup for entertaining guests? Yun Yang smiled faintly and said, Let me learn from all of you. I want to see if the Four Seasons Tower's everlasting reputation is worthy of its name. Spring replied, I just want to learn from the renowned Lord Supreme Cloud's skills before the chief does. He smiled casually. I've fought with Lord Supreme Cloud in the dark for so long, but I've never had the chance to learn from you personally. If I were to attack you with all of my men, it would be too much of a disrespect to Lord Supreme Cloud. Yun Yang smiled. I understand. It was indeed understandable. Which one of these people was not a top-notch expert? Which one of these top-notch experts was not a proud and arrogant person? How could they be willing to abandon their identities and gang up on each other when they did not understand the other party's strength? Especially when the other party was just a small fry not long ago. All the more reason not to make a fuss about it. Lord Supreme Cloud, please. Spring smiled faintly, his demeanor dignified. Yun Yang smiled back. Please. At this moment, the purple chi in Yun Yang's deific consciousness space surged and billowed. Emmy's rare liveliness was nowhere to be seen. It stood quietly and solemnly, fully focused on helping Yun Yang, not daring to slack off. After all, this moment was the most direct reflection of life and death for Emmy. In his dantian, mystical qi was circulating at a high speed. Yun Yang's face was faintly suffused with purple qi. His right hand stretched out slowly, his fair and slender fingers stretched out in front of him. He smiled faintly and said, "The final battle is about to begin. Let me start annihilating spring first. After today's battle, the 4 seasons shall cease to exist, and the end of the year shall cease to be a year." Clang! A loud and clear clang of a saber rang out, shaking everyone's heart. It was a heart-stirring sound. A long, elegant saber with a smooth, elegant design, appeared in Yun Yang's palm out of thin air. Under the illumination of the sun, the saber's blade actually glowed in 7 colors, making it look even more dazzling. The long saber hummed automatically in Yun Yang's hand, like a warrior who had been looking forward to a battle for a long time finally appearing in front of the battlefield. It was an indescribable thrill, filled with a thirst for blood. Good saber. Spring's eyes glowed. Yun Yang let out a long howl. There are clouds in the sky, and there is a saber above the clouds. The human heart is like the clouds, and heaven's will is like the saber. With the hands of the clouds, holding the saber of heaven's will, I shall send you on your way. He then raised the long saber above his head and hollered, "Come on, let's fight." Before his words echoed in the air, the saber had already slashed down, its power unstoppable and unstoppable. The saber's power was impressive, but in the eyes of the opponents, they were too far apart. There was a space of 50 to 60 feet. How could they defeat the enemy if they only attacked from where they stood? Therefore, the 7 opponents sneered at the same time. What was the point of attacking from such a distance in a battle of this level? Was he trying to establish his dominance, or was he trying to be funny? There was no need to pay attention to such an attack. Could it be that Supreme Cloud was relying on his demeanor and had purposely made a feint? However, the next moment, the 7 of them were shocked. Chapter 833. This was because the moment Yun Yang's saber was swung out, it underwent a transformation that was beyond everyone's understanding under the watchful eyes of the crowd. The gleaming saber that was initially only 3 feet long suddenly underwent a transformation the moment it was about to slash downwards. It was a massive and shocking transformation. The moment the saber fell, it expanded into a giant saber that was 70 feet long. The slanted slash in the air suddenly transformed into a sweeping attack that enveloped all 7 men at the same time. Furthermore, the saber's edge that seemed to be deliberately going easy on the opponent had actually turned into lightning. The instantaneous increase in speed was more than 10 times. Each of the 4 Seasons Tower's men who were sent out to fight had a wealth of combat experience. They had been through more than 100 battles in their lifetime. However, even though these 7 men had lived for close to 10,000 years, they had never encountered such a bizarre situation. What he wielded was a saber, not a bolt of lightning in the sky that could be as long as it wanted to be. This was a transformation that exceeded the logic of any ordinary person. The saber light turned from a bolt of lightning into a murderous gleam that cut through the heaven and earth. January, February, and moons, who bore the brunt of the attack, made a serious misjudgment of the sudden change in the situation. They almost didn't have any time to react. With a flash of light, they were all cut into 2 and died just like that. Their cultivation path was painted like a cake. Until the very last moment, their faces still carried a mocking smile towards the saber. Yun Yang had planned this attack before he acted, setting up the trap first. He did not hold back once he struck, killing 3 men consecutively when they least expected it. Even after successfully killing 3 men, the saber's momentum did not falter as it chased after the 4th man. The saber light plunged straight down. In fact, the 4th man had died because of the saber as well. It was just that when Yun Yang killed the 4th man, a loud clang was heard when the saber swept past the man's waist. It was as if the saber had struck an extremely sturdy piece of metal. Although the 4th man had died from the slash, the unparalleled momentum of the saber had to stop because of it. The saber did not belong to the human realm. When everyone reacted, some of it had already ended. Everything happened so suddenly. Only after a moment did blood soar into the sky. The smell of blood instantly assaulted the nostrils and swept through the surroundings. The remaining 3 men stared at Yun Yang in disbelief and then at the ground, their eyes reddened. It was only now that they realized just how murderous that slash was. But what followed was endless grief and indignation. They had been fighting side by side for so many years, but 4 of them had died in the blink of an eye under the other party's single slash. Moreover, it was done in such a strange way. Under the watchful eyes of everyone. How could the rest of them endure this? Despicable. Spring was no longer able to maintain his elegant demeanor, and he roared furiously, his eyes about to split open. Despicable? Is it really despicable? Yun Yang held the divine edge that had reverted to its original length and said in slight surprise, "This is the final battle. Any means should be used, any means should be used." This is a cliché. I'm used to reminding my enemies, enlightening them for the rest of their lives, so that they won't regret even in death. What I find strange is that you all know that the battle has already begun. Even though I struck first, you all could have dodged it. Why didn't you? Couldn't you wait to die? The 3 of them almost spat blood in anger at his words. Dodging? How could we? How could we dodge this strange attack that we had never dreamt of even 1,000 times in our lives? How could we dodge it? Reminding our enemies, enlightening them for the rest of their lives, so that they won't regret even in death? If you're so eloquent, why don't you just go to heaven and pretend to be a wise man in heaven and enlighten the masses? Fortunately, the 3 of them were experienced cultivators whose cultivation base and state of mind had reached the pinnacle. With a long howl of grief and indignation, they calmed themselves and launched a counterattack at the same time. Naturally, they turned into a triangular offensive formation, surrounding Yun Yang from 3 directions. A saber, a sword, and a flute, the sharp sound of the wind breaking rang through the peak, filling the eyes with ghostly shrieks. The divine edge that had reverted to its original size danced rapidly in Yun Yang's hand. The saber light changed and blocked the 3 of them. Although he was besieged, he did not retreat an inch. Yun Yang did not use saber truth, destiny blade to attack. How could he really reveal his trump card before the enemy appeared? However, the vigorous and abundant mystical chi made every slash of his saber filled with an unstoppable, domineering aura. Spring and the 2 envoys suppressed the extreme grief and indignation in their hearts and fought with all their might, wanting nothing more than to grind Yun Yang's bones into dust with a single strike. It was a pity that the 3 of them could only fight Yun Yang to a draw despite their combined efforts. Ji Lingxi stood on the side, watching the battle with rapt attention. Then, she heaved a soft sigh of relief. Yun Yang's first strike had caught the enemy off guard and killed more than half of the enemy's combat power. Now, he had even taken the initiative to control the battle. The current situation was not a problem at all. The so-called siege was more of Yun Yang's accumulation of power and preparation for the upcoming battle. After all, there were at least 22 superb experts hiding in the forest, waiting for a chance to strike. Since Yun Yang's side was safe, she would focus her attention on the ambushes that had yet to appear. It was better to be safe than sorry. At this time, Ji Lingxi was surprised to find that the corpse of the 4 Seasons Tower's divine envoy, who was dressed in yellow clothes, was glowing with a yellow light. The yellow light was mainly distributed in 2 places, one on the neck and the other on the waist. Ji Lingxi watched for a while longer and could not help but feel that something was amiss. Profound cultivators had different attributes in their cultivation methods. It was not surprising that the mystical chi that was condensed to protect or even attack was mixed with a unique glow. Water, fire, wind, and thunder each had their own hue. However, no matter how outstanding a cultivator was, once he died, his qi would dissipate and his cultivation method would vanish along with his life. Now that the divine envoy had been sliced into two by Yun Yang's saber and could not be more dead, why was his body still glowing? Ji Lingxi observed carefully and realized that it was definitely not the reflection of a weapon. It was really the glow of the dead body. Then, the question was, what was going on? It was very unusual. Ji Lingxi's heart skipped a beat. She extended her hand and made a grabbing motion, causing the corpse on the ground to fly towards her. Chapter 834. It was Mr. Nian, who had spoken to Yun Yang earlier. Before Ji Lingxi could speak, Mr. Nian had already vanished with the corpse in his arms. He did not seem to care about his three subordinates, who were locked in a bitter battle not far away and were in danger of being overturned at any moment. Yun Yang brandished his saber and forced Spring back 30 feet. He laughed and said, "Mr. Nian, so many people around here are just here to watch. Both sides are on the same page. A battle of life and death is bound to happen sooner or later. Why not come forward and have a good fight?" Mr. Nian's voice drifted over slowly. "In this final battle, I have to give you the respect you deserve as Supreme Cloud. It's hard to be fair when the martial world's grudges are settled. However, in this final battle of life and death that was initiated by Lord Supreme Cloud, not only do we have the advantage of setting up the spiritual restraining formation first, we also have the advantage of numbers. Let's create a relatively fair battle environment as a form of repayment." Yun Yang smiled faintly. Fair? No matter how fair it is, it's still a battle of numbers. Why do you have to deceive yourself and deceive others? Such an act will only make others despise you even more. There was a hint of amusement in Mr. Nian's voice. Whether we deceive ourselves or not depends on the person. Our main strategy in this battle is indeed to swarm forward and end this battle as soon as possible. However, Spring has volunteered to measure Supreme Cloud's worth first. As the leader, I have to fulfill this old official's wish and let him fight you with his own strategy. Life and death, no regrets. Yun Yang was moved. Even if we die because of this? The dead are gone. What about those who are lucky enough to survive? There are so many of you here, are you just going to watch? Mr. Nian's voice was indifferent. Life and death are the same. Even if we die because of this, it's a choice made by Spring and his subordinates. This is the decision of all of us. Not only is it out of respect for you, it's also out of respect for our own lives and deaths. No matter what happened in the past, we have to bear the consequences of our own choices on the battlefield. No matter how anxious we are now, we can only wait until the outcome of the battle is clear. Yun Yang let out a long howl and said, "I understand now. If so, I shall send these three on their way first. I can't bear to let you all feel as if your hearts are frying in oil, so I shall grant you a quick death." Before he finished speaking, the saber move suddenly changed. The saber light spread out in all directions like a rippling light wave. In an instant, it engulfed the entire area, including the entire area. The blade was merciless, and the Tao was merciless, one move and two styles converged. With a whooshing sound, the saber light shone brightly. The three of them had a strange feeling at the same time. At this moment, they weren't facing a single person, but the might of the grand Tao that they'd been pursuing all their lives. Every cultivator who embarked on this path of cultivation could only rely on their own efforts to defy the heavens and go against the current. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As long as there was the slightest mistake, there would be no mercy. This was the ultimate truth of cultivation, a truth that every profound cultivator knew. However, at this moment, all three of them were shocked to realize that the path they had taken had been wrong from the beginning. Even though they had stumbled their way to where they were now and persevered until now, there was no way to go on, and the future was bleak. The spring bearer's expression turned ghastly as he yelled at the sky, am I wrong? So it turns out that the path I took was actually the wrong one? Have I made so many mistakes? Amidst the screams, he was dazed and suddenly stunned. However, it was this moment of distraction that allowed a ray of saber light to sweep past his body. A body quietly split into two halves. The upper half flew out diagonally and landed on the ground, but he clearly didn't feel the slightest pain. He raised his head and asked the sky, "Is it really wrong? Then, what is the right thing to do?" Before he could finish his sentence, the upper half of his body fell to the sky, no longer breathing. The illusory path of Tao suddenly split in a flash. Another two clangs rang out as the two gods' envoys were struck one after another, bleeding profusely and severely injured. However, both of them had gods' bones, and their physical strength was much stronger than that of others. They didn't die immediately, but their gazes were still dazed as they murmured, "Wrong? How could it be wrong?" Yunyang snorted and said, "The emergence of the Nine Supremes is driven by Tao, driven by heaven's will. The Four Seasons Tower is defying heaven's will, how can it not be wrong?" The two men's gazes were dazed for a moment, but then they became unusually fierce and ruthless. They yelled angrily, "The cultivation of the human body is to cultivate from the mortal body to the realm of immortality. Who isn't going against the current, going against heaven's will? Why are we the ones who are wrong?" Despite the two men's cries, the path of Tao in the sky clearly showed that they were wrong, they were wrong. Were they wrong? The two of them suddenly felt disheartened. The bright heavens will in the sky was telling them everything. Your path is wrong. There was no way forward. The two men roared, "We have God's bones in us, we're gods when we gather them. What did we do wrong? What's wrong with that?" As they screamed, they swung their sabers with all their might, blocking the countless saber lights from the path of Tao. The saber lights in the sky changed, and the door of Tao was also changing endlessly. It seemed to be saying one thing. You've installed God's bones in your bodies, but you didn't cultivate them yourself after all. So you're wrong. Even if you're gods in your eyes, why are you all a pile of bones in the end? Because they're not real gods after all. If so, they're already wrong, but you're still walking on a path that's even more wrong. Aren't you all even more wrong? Adding mistakes on top of mistakes, how can you still live? The two men listened to the voice of Tao as they defended. Suddenly, they felt hopeless. Mistakes on top of mistakes. Mistakes on top of mistakes. Amidst the screams, the determination to die in their eyes suddenly turned into despair. Since we're wrong, what's the point of living? Laughing bitterly, they pounced forward. Facing the divine edge, they did not evade, not fearing death at all. Saber Laic. A red mist suddenly appeared, descending from the sky. What appeared with the blurry light and shadow seemed to be another world of mortals. Seeing such a strange scene, both of them were shocked. Although they swung their swords to the left and right with all their might, they no longer had any offensive power to speak of. A faint mist-like saber light flashed past the necks of the two people. The outcome was decided. Two large human heads flew out, rolling in the air. However, the two men looked strangely calm. It was as if they had finally been freed, as if they had finally found the path of Tao. Wherever the saber light passed, blood splattered on the ground, overturning the mortal world. Yunyang retracted his saber and stood upright, murmuring to himself, "So, this is the real Destiny blade, every slash, is God's will." Previously, when he had used Saber Truth, Destiny Blade, it had always been a man wielding the saber, winning the battle with exquisite saber skills. This time, however, Emi was fully focused, handing all of its power to Yunyang. Emi's deific consciousness had even merged with Yunyang's, allowing Yunyang to discover the deeper essence of Saber Truth, Destiny Blade for the first time. The power of Destiny Blade that he had unleashed in the past was only the tip of the iceberg. It was like scratching an itch through one's boot, it had yet to achieve its true meaning. Chapter 835. Soft sighs could be heard coming from the dark forest. A few silhouettes in yellow drifted out and moved the remains of the 6 corpses into the Temple of 9 Supremes, settling them down appropriately. One of them had just walked out of the temple when he smiled faintly. Lord Supreme Cloud is indeed worthy of the title of Supreme Wit. You're wise and resourceful indeed. The saber in your hand is marvelous and helpful. His words were insinuating that Yun Yang's ability to easily kill the 7 men was due to his strange weapon. Furthermore, he was hoping that Yun Yang would lose his composure after his great victory. Furthermore, he was young and impetuous. If he did not use this weapon, the other side would have taken advantage of him. Yun Yang replied faintly, I was the one who initiated this battle. How can I be unprepared and facing a situation where I'm outnumbered in this battle of life and death? It's my fortune to be in possession of a weapon. Are you questioning the fairness of your esteemed tower's words? Yun Yang's reply was to use his own words against his own shield. You say that I won with a weapon and waver my state of mind. I'll say that you're dissatisfied with the other side's leader's main idea and disturb your Tao heart. Let's see who will give in first. The person said coldly, Supreme Cloud, there's no need to speak irresponsibly and sow discord. I've long been indifferent to matters of life and death. However, the debt of blood is still fresh in my mind. There must be recompense. Yun Yang replied mockingly, the debt of blood is still fresh in my mind? What I'm doing now is exactly what you've said. It's a pity that Lord Supreme Cloud's ultimate move can only be used once. I hope Lord Supreme Cloud has some other luck. Otherwise, you'll be a harbinger of misfortune and blood will be spilled everywhere. The person snorted coldly and disappeared into the dense forest in a flash. The ground was still drenched in fresh blood, but Ji Lingxi and Yun Yang were the only ones left alive. However, both of them knew that the real battle had only begun from this moment onwards. In the initial battle just now, Mr. Nian had used the lives of 7 men to completely suppress the 4 Seasons Tower's contempt towards Supreme Cloud. Of course, this result was largely due to the Springbringer's dissatisfaction, but at the end of the day, if they did not let someone try and see what was going on, everyone would inevitably be dissatisfied. After all, no matter how much Yun Yang's cultivation base had improved and how strong he seemed to be, he did not have a battle record that was worthy of it. Moreover, he was trapped in the spiritual restraining formation, unable to use the manifestation powers that he was famous for. It was only natural that he would be looked down upon. In spite of this, Yun Yang and Mr. Nian were certain that if they were to recklessly go up against Supreme Cloud with the mentality of dealing with an ant, it was still unknown whether Yun Yang would be finished, but the 4 Seasons Tower's loss would definitely be much more than these 7 people. If they were not careful, the 4 Seasons Tower's top-notch combat power might be completely annihilated. On the surface, it looked like the 4 Seasons Tower had lost 7 experts, but no one had underestimated their enemy. It was worth it, and he died a worthy death. Now, no matter who it was, no one would treat Supreme Cloud as an ordinary opponent. The 4 Seasons Tower's mentality now was that Yun Yang was an unparalleled expert who had even surpassed Ling Xiaozue back in the day. The situation before them was clear. Although Yun Yang's first successful slash was due to using a mystical saber that no one knew about and catching them off guard, Yun Yang was still the one who had firmly suppressed and controlled the entire situation when he faced the 3 men's joint attack. Furthermore, not only was Yun Yang not injured after killing these 3 men, his breathing did not even become heavier. This meant that Yun Yang's mystical qi consumption was limited in the intense battle just now. Even if it was not negligible, it would have a limited impact on the subsequent battle. If the 4 Seasons Tower's men who had come to this conclusion still could not see how terrifying Yun Yang was, then they could really just line up under a crooked tree and hang themselves. Light clouds floated in the sky as the north wind blew and the sun shone brightly. It was already noon. In spite of this, the forest on Tianxian Cliff was shrouded in darkness. The visibility was terrifyingly low. From afar, Fu Baogua and the others could see that Tianxian Cliff was shrouded in thick fog that obscured the entire mountain ridge. The fog gradually spread to the surroundings, and in just a short period of time, nothing could be seen anymore. Only the faint chimes of swords and sabers could be heard from time to time, indicating that the war of the century was still ongoing. Yun Yang walked slowly in the thick fog while Ji Lingxi, who was wielding a long sword, was in front of him. Ji Lingxi insisted on walking in front of Yun Yang to ensure that everything was safe. Unable to dissuade her, Yun Yang could only agree. After all, based on the current situation, this was the best strategy. Right now, the enemies were all hidden in the dark. If the two of them still did not move in front of the temple, they would definitely become targets. The only way was to take the initiative to move. Even though they still did not know where the enemies were hiding, as long as they moved, they would not fall into the extremely bad situation of being surrounded by 22 people. With Ji Lingxi leading the way, this strategy of turning passivity into initiative was further perfected. The Four Seasons Tower might be able to tell from Ji Lingxi's movements, aura, and other aspects that her ability was extraordinary, perhaps even above Yun Yang's, but it was impossible for them to know that her greatest trump card was the red light barrier. After all, to Ji Lingxi, it was no longer a matter of whether or not she was afraid to fight, she was afraid that she would not fight. Just as both of them stepped into a thick bush, the ground caved in without a sound. This change happened abruptly, and the area of the collapse was as large as 100 feet in radius. Following the abrupt change, two beams of saber and sword light shot towards them from 4 different directions, still silent and undetectable. All of this was like a pantomime that was happening in a completely dark space. The entire process was soundless, but it was filled with murderous intent. Both Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi were on high alert. They had floated up the moment the ground caved in. However, their action of floating up seemed to be automatically sending themselves up for the other party's attack. 8 beams of cold light shot towards them at the same time, their timing perfect. It was obvious that they had already predicted Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi's movements and had already planned their follow-up attacks. In spite of this, Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi did not panic in the face of the attacks coming from all directions. They did not stop floating and pounced forward, one from the left and the other from the right. They were as silent as ghosts. Yun Yang's silent counterattack was instantaneous. His upended river of blood spilled out, the saber light that hung from the sky had already blocked all the incoming sharp beams of energy, producing a tinkling sound. Amidst the momentary stalemate, the next reincarnation under saber counterattacked with full force. Chapter 836. Only at the farthest end of this dark path, as if it was the end of the sky, was a faint glimmer that could only be vaguely seen but could not be seen clearly. Although they did not know what path it was and there were no hints, all the enemies who were attacking Yun Yang had a clear understanding in their hearts, it was the path of reincarnation. Legend had it that only the underworld's underworld had a reincarnation passage. This pitch-black road seemed to be able to attract all the attention of the witnesses. It was filled with an indescribable and indescribable temptation, causing everyone's mind to be in turmoil when they saw it. In a trance, they could not help but think of their past and present lives. The unique light of reincarnation under saber shone in front of him. As Yun Yang struck, he felt his wrist vibrate violently as a powerful force surged towards him. Then, he felt the resistance vanish and relaxed. Then, a low grunt came from afar. Yun Yang's thoughts raced as he quickly deduced that it was his divine edge clashing with the other party's weapon that caused the initial head-on feeling. The other party's cultivation base was impressive, otherwise, how could the residual force have affected him? In spite of this, the divine edge's unparalleled sharpness continued, breaking the other party's weapon after only a brief stalemate and injuring the other party. The silhouette in the dark flickered again as two more rays of light shot towards Yunyang. Just as Yunyang's saber broke a person's weapon and took the opportunity to injure him, they had already arrived in front of Yunyang. Yunyang dared not delay as he retreated swiftly. As the saber light turned and swept horizontally, his right palm slammed behind him as well. With a loud boom, the ambusher from behind was sent flying by his palm while the long sword of the ambusher from the other side was broken by the divine edge. However, there was a limit to one's strength. Even though Yunyang had parried with all his might, it was still difficult for him to evade the last attack. He could only tilt his body slightly as a sharp gleam flashed past his chest. Despite the pain in Yunyang's chest, he had already retracted his saber and retaliated with merciless Dao. The force of his attack was several times more ferocious than before. With a crisp clang, the last attacker from all four directions somersaulted away. As that person retreated, the enemies from all four directions retreated at the same time as if they had discussed it beforehand. On the other side, Ji Lingxi's long sword was moving in a disorderly manner. Her movements were as dazzling as fireworks, but she was only attacking without defending, surprising her four opponents. In this world, how could there be a girl with such profound cultivation, such explosive battle prowess, and such a valiant fighting style? Seeing is better than hearing 100 times. However, to fight us with such a flawed fighting style, no matter how high his cultivation base is, he will still die. How can there be a fluke? The moment their eyes met, both of them had already made the first move. They worked together to parry Ji Lingxi's sword, while one of them channeled his palm energy to divert Ji Lingxi's right hand away. The last of them found an opening and darted to Ji Lingxi's right side, slashing down with his saber. His target was the vital part of Ji Lingxi's slender neck, showing no mercy at all. At this point in the battle, Ji Lingxi was already on the brink of death. Even with a ridiculously high cultivation base, it was impossible for her to take on such an attack that was aimed at her vitals. In spite of this, Ji Lingxi did not seem to feel anything. She was still madly channeling her strength to attack the twin swords in front of her, determined to break through the interception and claim the enemy's life. In the blink of an eye, the saber light was like lightning. With a loud thud, it had already landed precisely on Ji Lingxi's neck. The person who had attacked extended his other hand with his fingers spread wide, obviously planning to behead Ji Lingxi and carry it away with his other hand to intimidate Yunyang later. Once he thought about how he had beheaded Yunyang's right-hand man, a confidant with unfathomable abilities, and how he would toss the beautiful head in front of Yunyang later, he would like to see if this supreme cloud, who had awed the continent, would break down at once and have his soul dissipate. The person's gaze was cruel, his hand ready to strike. However, at the next moment, he was stunned. The powerful strike that could split mountains and split rocks had landed on the vital part of Ji Lingxi's neck, but her head had not been chopped off. No, not only had it not been chopped off, there was no sense of impact at all. What was going on? Could it be that this woman's defensive cultivation method was unique? Was that why she was attacking without any defense at all? As the thought flashed through his mind, he saw a flash of red light rise. What was going on? Was this a sign of a unique cultivation method? The person who attacked saw that the red light was gradually expanding, and it was actually rushing towards me? What the hell is this? Why is it so strange? The person's train of thought came to an abrupt halt at this moment. Because at this moment, he suddenly had a feeling that his body seemed to have collided with a mountain? A mountain that had flown hundreds of thousands of miles in the blink of an eye? If he had to describe it, perhaps it could be described in a way that everyone could understand. A sports car that was speeding at high speed had crashed into a high-speed train that was traveling at full speed. Furthermore, it had collided head-on with the high-speed train. Then, there was a loud crash. The other three people who were defending against Ji Lingxi's relentless attacks looked over in surprise, only to see their comrade fly up in confusion. Like an eagle, he opened his arms and soared into the sky at high speed. If you are an eagle, then soar into the sky. Yes, this comrade's posture was too similar. However, why did this eagle soar into the sky at an unparalleled speed and not come down for a long time? Then, the answer was revealed. The figure that soared into the sky and soared into the sky was clearly still ascending, but his body seemed to be unable to bear the burden and was disintegrating. Yes, it was disintegrating. His head, limbs, and body had all fallen apart. Could it be that he had soared too fast and the air resistance was too strong, causing his body to disintegrate? The minds of the three people spun quickly, but they still could not figure out what was going on. How could everything be so strange? The woman in front of them was still maintaining her aggressive attack mode, the sword in her hand exerting 300% of its power. The reason was simple. She was not defending at all. Offense was the best defense, but it did not mean that one should not defend at all. That's right. Didn't I just see someone chop her neck with a knife? That was a direct hit. Why could she still attack? It was then that Ji Lingxi realized that no matter how hard she tried to attack, she still could not do anything to the three men who were working together to neutralize her attacks. In a fit of rage, she suddenly hollered and sheathed her sword, charging straight at the three men. What kind of strategy was this? How could there be such a strategy in this world? This was no longer fearless, it was simply courting death, okay? The three people were shocked to see this. There must be something wrong with this abnormal behavior. There must be something fishy about the other party's actions when she was in a fit of rage. Two of them dared not act rashly, retreating swiftly as Ji Lingxi charged at the person in the middle like a mad bull. Seeing that he could not dodge in time, the person in the front thrust his sword out without hesitation, striking Ji Lingxi's heart. Chapter 837. The sword had pierced right into her heart. The man was still in disbelief when his strike landed. This woman's real cultivation base is more than a level higher than mine. It's just that her combat experience is shallow. How could she have been stabbed in the heart without any resistance? The thought ended there. There was no room for it to continue, because the moment the sword was pierced, a red light appeared as expected. A massive force of recoil surged forth. Then, the sword turned into dust with a puff, and the red light swept over. The other party was shocked, and hurriedly withdrew his hand, wanting to dodge as fast as possible. Unfortunately, the red light was too fast, or at least much faster than he had imagined. A massive force came into contact with his hand. He felt that his right hand that could split tigers and leopards had vanished without a trace. Yes, it had vanished. He did not even have the time to feel the pain. It was gone in an instant, and the red light was already in front of the man. The man was flung away, but he managed to react in time. He shouted loudly, "There's something strange about this woman. There's a recoil, a recoil." Before he could finish his words, he had been flung thousands of feet away by the red light and was torn into pieces. He died without a complete corpse. The other two men watched as another of their companions was mysteriously flung to death. His body was torn into pieces, and he died horribly. Faced with such an anomaly, they could not help breaking out in cold sweat, their hairs standing on end. What was going on? How could two brothers who had been with each other for thousands of years be flung away so swiftly and dismembered? They had never seen such a strange thing in their lives. One of them had slashed someone's neck and died from the recoil. The other had stabbed his sword into someone's heart and died from the recoil. No matter how they looked at it, it was too surreal. It was equally shocking. The battle was complicated and tedious to describe with words, but the actual process had happened in the blink of an eye. It had happened, passed, disappeared, and everything was over. The other party disappeared from the thick fog and retreated. In the blink of an eye, the turbulent fog calmed down. Yunyang retrieved the divine edge from the thick fog. As expected, he saw a line of blood slowly trickling down the blade's blade. Just like before, in the blink of an eye, the blade of the saber regained its snow-white luster, untainted by even a speck of dust. It was like a stream of autumn water overflowing in the thick fog, sparkling and radiating brilliance. Looking at the saber in his hand, she murmured, "Legend has it that some treasured sabers have the mystical effect of automatically absorbing the fog in places like this. I wonder if it's true. Can this saber of yours do the same?" Ji Lingxi had no idea when she had come to his side. Looking at the flawless saber that was getting brighter and brighter in the thick fog, Yunyang said faintly, "This saber of mine has such a mystical ability. However, what we see now is the fog formed by the formation. Even if the saber can absorb the fog is produced continuously. The effect of a unilateral absorption is minimal and not very useful. But this saber has other uses in the thick fog." Yunyang chuckled softly. "There were a total of 8 people in this wave of attack, right?" Ji Lingxi asked excitedly, "How many did you kill?" Yunyang coughed dryly and thought about it carefully before saying, "It seems like 2 of them were injured, but they've all escaped. The other party's abilities are formidable and they're opportunistic. It's not easy to kill them." Ji Lingxi chuckled. "How is it not easy to kill them? I killed 2 of them without much effort." What she meant was that he did not kill a single one of them while she killed 2 effortlessly. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Yunyang coughed. "Was it really effortless? Then you didn't kill them, but shocked them?" His tone sounded like a question, but it was actually a direct confirmation that the matter had been decided. Ji Lingxi snorted and stood with her arms behind her back. She lifted her head and said faintly, "I've never cared about the process when I do things. I only look at the results. If the enemy is dead, then they're dead. If it was effortless, then it was effortless. This is the truth, the indisputable truth. The rest is not up for discussion." What a strong reason. It was hard to refute. Yunyang had no energy to retort at this moment. He only had the urge to grab the girl and spank her bottom. However, it was only a thought, he could not put it into action. After all, the red light was cold and did not differentiate friend from foe. It was merciless when it came to dealing with him. Fiancé? Sweetheart? All of them were suppressed mercilessly. After all, this child was the biggest enemy of the person who had set up the red light. He was a little white pig who had taken the white jade cabbage. How could he have the audacity to grumble when he was incompetent? On the other side, none of the Four Seasons Tower's men were waiting at their original ambush positions. Instead, they had gathered at a secluded spot. Among them, there were a few whose expressions were completely unsightly. They were extremely unsightly. 2 of them who were injured had slightly better complexions. Although they appeared weary, their fighting spirit had not waned. However, the other 2, although they were not injured, their faces were deathly pale, paler than a dead person's face. Their eyes were filled with fear, like birds startled by the twang of a bowstring, in a constant state of anxiety. The entire secret valley was silent. When the crowd looked at Mr. Nian, their gazes were evasive. Mr. Nian looked at the 19 men in front of him. After a moment of silence, he said, "Now, who else thinks that Supreme Cloud's reputation is undeserved? Who else thinks that Supreme Cloud can't withstand a single blow and can be easily killed? Step forward." No one uttered a sound. Supreme Cloud's only reliance was his manifestation powers. He himself was merely a weakling. After this battle, the knowledge of his mediocre ability had long become a thing of the past. Mr. Nian stood up with his arms on his back and said faintly, "Then, who else thinks that you have the ability to fight alone? Please step forward and challenge Supreme Cloud. I'm glad to see you succeed. I'll send you off with all sincerity." Still, no one moved. Everyone present was aware of Yun Yang's ability, and he was assisted by the peerless blade. What was the difference between fighting him alone and seeking death? Mr. Nian said softly, "Yutong's Supreme Cloud is renowned throughout the world. He became one of the 9 Supremes at such a young age, stirring the winds and clouds of Tianxian. He's always been one of the 9 Supreme strategists. He's the brainchild of the 9 Supremes. Victory can be decided from 1,000 miles away within his command tent. It can even be said that Supreme Cloud alone can shoulder half of the great reputation that the 9 Supremes have built throughout their journey, perhaps more. When the 9 Supremes were still around, perhaps Supreme Earth's planning was part of it, but Supreme Cloud's role in it was still not to be underestimated. After such a long time and searching the world, their true identities still couldn't be found. How could Supreme Earth plan so thoroughly alone? Thinking deeper, is Supreme Cloud's title of Supreme with just a rumor, or does he live up to his name? Is he truly worthy of his reputation? Chapter 838. After the incident at Tianxian Cliff, Supreme Cloud was lucky to escape, but he was still gravely injured. Now that we've gathered the past information, the reason why he was called a good-for-nothing back then was because he had healed himself with a lot of heaven and earth treasures and the flesh of spiritual beasts due to his severe injuries. The process took more than 8 months. It was about a year after the battle at Tianxian Cliff that our 4 Seasons Tower's spies were uprooted one by one. This proves that Supreme Cloud had launched an operation as soon as he returned to Tiantang City. He found clues in an extremely short amount of time and captured the culprit. What do you think of this wisdom? Mr. Nian looked at the crowd. Even without the wisdom and setup, Supreme Cloud's ability back then was nothing more than an ant. Yet, it was his meager ability that turned the 4 Seasons Tower upside down. All of you call yourselves veterans of the martial world, arrogantly challenging the heavens and the earth, yet you can't even catch him. You're nothing but a laughing stock. Today, Supreme Cloud's ability has improved tremendously, yet all of you are still standing where you are, overtaken and suppressed by others. Today, Supreme Cloud has jumped out and proposed a decisive battle. All of you will only blame it on me. Why didn't you agree to it immediately? Why didn't you act immediately? All of you are blindly optimistic that this is the best time to eradicate Supreme Cloud? All of you think that this battle is enough to settle everything once and for all. What a beautiful dream. It's a pity that all of you are too ugly. No matter how beautiful your dreams are, it's all in vain. Why didn't all of you think about why Supreme Cloud, a wise man, would propose a decisive battle at this time? Mr. Nian's cold gaze looked at the crowd. In other words, if he wasn't confident, why would he propose a decisive battle so hastily? Has Supreme Cloud suddenly become stupid? Is he rushing to his death? Haven't any of you thought about it? If Supreme Cloud isn't confident in his revenge, why would he propose a decisive battle at this time? The longer this drags on, the more secure his status as a human legend will be. There's still room for improvement in his ability. Then, the next question is, what gives him such confidence? Against the entire 4 Seasons Tower, what else can guarantee his revenge other than absolute combat power? Mr. Nian smirked as he looked at them one by one. What happened now proves that you didn't take these facts to heart at all. I've said more than once that to deal with Yun Yang, the current Supreme Cloud, the danger must be higher than that of Ling Xiaozui and Du Guchou. You lot may have agreed verbally, but you're not convinced in your hearts. You're even complaining about my arrangements. The final battle is at hand, yet you're letting your personal pride occupy the majority of your thoughts. Spring is the representative, but when you personally saw Spring fighting, what was the result? All 7 of them were wiped out in an instant. The dense fog attack had also confined the battle within the spiritual restraining array. It could be said that they had the geographical advantage. But in the end, the second time the 8 of them attacked together, 2 were injured and 2 were killed. Mr. Nian said with a pained tone, 29 of the 4 Seasons Tower's pinnacle combatants are here. Each of them can be independent in the martial world, they can dominate an area. But after just one exchange, 9 of them died. Do you think that this reality is inevitable? What do you mean by Supreme Cloud Saber is unparalleled? Why had he not thought of it earlier? Yun Yang had only possessed this godly weapon today? Isn't a weapon a part of a weapon grandmaster's ability? The person who said this should be beaten to death. He knew that he had lost the right time, place, and manpower, yet he still came to the battle. What's so strange about having a unique weapon? Don't tell me that you've never guarded against your opponent's weapon when you fight? You've been killed just like that, yet you still have the face to cry injustice? How am I being wronged? As for the girl's peculiarity, Mr. Nian sighed. Shouldn't she be? Isn't this reasonable and expected? If there's nothing peculiar about her, why would Supreme Cloud bring such a delicate little girl to this final battle? Just because she's capable and can fight? Mr. Nian said heavily and angrily, in a battle like this, anyone Supreme Cloud can bring here must be of great help to him. Since they're of great help to him, they're also of great harm to us. Isn't this little bit of knowledge expected and reasonable? Do I even need to say it? All of you are veterans of the martial world for over 1,000 years. Isn't thinking of defeat the key to victory the key to a final battle? Why wouldn't you all be extremely cautious of the helper he brought, someone whose identity and background we don't know at all? Why didn't he bring Ling Xiaozui and Du Guchou? Why did he bring this little girl instead? Has no one thought about this? Only when you've been injured and killed did you come running over to say that there's something wrong with Supreme Cloud Saber, that there's something wrong with Supreme Cloud's woman. Are all of you idiots? Have all of you wasted your lives after so many years? How could you make such a low-level mistake? How could you all complain that I shouldn't have paid so much attention to Supreme Cloud? Where are your hearts? Mr. Nian rubbed the space between his brows tiredly. What else do you have to say now? What else can you say? Say it. A middle-aged man dressed in red sighed soundlessly, his face filled with shame. This person was Summerbringer. Initially, he had the same thought as Springbringer, who had died in Yun Yang's hands. If Springbringer had not taken the initiative, he might have been the first to die in Yun Yang's hands, as he had the same thought. Looking at it now, there was only endless lingering fear, the fear of death and the unknown. What's the point of talking about the past? Are you watching so many brothers die in vain in Supreme Cloud's hands because of this *T reason? Winterbringer, who was dressed in white, asked with a frown. A disunited team might as well not exist at all. Mr. Nian said faintly, what does it matter if disobedient and untrustworthy subordinates die? If we can survive, who knows how many enemies of the same level we'll have to face in the future. Even if I save them today, it's inevitable that they'll die in the hands of others. If so, it's better for those with ulterior motives to die here and now. After all, only by speaking with reality can one remember it vividly and never forget it. Even if there's only one subordinate left in the end, I hope that it's the one who has absolute trust in the right leader. Someone said with dissatisfaction, must there be ulterior motives if there's doubt and objection? Mr. Nian replied indifferently, in my opinion, there must be ulterior motives. He stood with his arms behind his back and took 2 slow steps before he sat down and said faintly, come and study this. See if there's any way to avoid Supreme Cloud Saber. Also, look at that strange girl. What's so magical about her? How should we deal with her? Chapter 839. Mr. Nian waited for the crowd's response after he finished speaking, but no one spoke for a long time. They all chose to remain silent. The 19 men did not make a sound, their expressions growing darker. They were either ghastly or cold, none of them were calm anymore. After a long while, someone finally spoke. According to the information we've gathered, the following conclusion can be drawn about Yun Yang's saber. Not only is this saber exceptionally sharp, it's also able to lengthen and shorten as it pleases. It's impossible to defend against and impossible to defend against. The weapons in our hands are top-notch weapons in this world, but under his saber, they'll be damaged, at most, for an instant. This alone is already a huge problem that's difficult to solve. One of the men stood up with blood dripping from his chest and said, "I have the right to speak on this point. Yun Yang's actual cultivation base is profound, but he's only one person after all. However, with his treasured saber in hand, his combat power has increased by more than a few times. We really can't defend against Yun Yang's sharpness. If we're careless, we'll be beheaded and sent to the underworld. If we don't solve this, I can't think of any chance of winning. We don't even know, we're not sure how many times our weapons can withstand the treasured saber's impact. This is the so-called saber tip drill. Yun Yang's toughness is more than beyond our expectations. He's even scarier than Ling Xiaozui and Dugu Chou working together. With our strength, even if we're going against 2 generations of unrivaled experts, we can still hold our own for a while without luck. However, when we're up against Yun Yang, it's hard to even hold our own. Furthermore, Yun Yang's cultivation base is exceptionally impressive. Although it's only been 2 short exchanges, his aura, combat power, and explosive force are all there. He's almost at the level of a leader. To be fair, even without this saber in hand, he's still a top-notch expert who doesn't pale in comparison to Ling Xiaozui back in the day. Furthermore, the combat power he's displaying now might not even be his limit. Do you know how much of his ability Yun Yang is using now? 70%, 90%, 100%, or perhaps only 50%? There's also something else that shouldn't be overlooked. The saber style that Yun Yang used was equally exquisite, the most exquisite I've ever seen in my life. But in terms of techniques, perhaps in this world, there is no one else who can match him. Combining these 3 advantages, with his unparalleled cultivation base, his unparalleled treasured saber, and his marvelous skill, Yun Yang alone is as dangerous as 3 Ling Xiaozui combined. The man let out a deep sigh. The chief's previous concerns were not wrong at all. We were too careless and underestimated the enemy. It was not that Yun Yang was overestimating the other party and destroying his own morale, but from the bottom of his heart, if he did not come up with any tricks in this battle and wanted to retreat in one piece, there was at least an 80% chance that Yun Yang could fulfill his wish. But on our side. At this point, he suddenly stopped and didn't continue. However, everyone understood what he meant. The current situation was that Yun Yang could leave if he wanted to, and they did not have much confidence in stopping him. Even if the battle came to a certain stage, Yun Yang could still come and go as he pleased to ensure his own safety. Even if they did not win this time, there was still room for a comeback. On the other hand, the Four Seasons Tower would suffer a huge loss and would not be able to lock onto the outcome of the battle. This was not an outcome that they would be happy to see, but it was the most likely outcome right now. Everyone's expression grew increasingly grim. Before Yun Yang's arrival, before the battle began, the Four Seasons Tower's people were brimming with confidence. They all thought that Yun Yang's identity had been exposed and that he had chosen to start the final battle out of helplessness. They were forced by the situation and had no choice but to do so. Victory was within their grasp. There was no doubt about the outcome of this battle from the very beginning. However, the reality now was almost the complete opposite. That woman's bizarre backlash is even more terrifying. Another person who had fought with Ji Lingxi was still pale. The two brothers clearly hit their targets earlier. There's no doubt about it. One of them slashed at her neck with a saber but was sent flying into the air and torn into pieces in midair. The other person stabbed her heart with a sword but died from the backlash as well. What's more terrifying is that she's actually unscathed despite being struck twice. This woman's cultivation base, based on our multiple clashes of weapons, is at least at the level of Ling Xiaozui and Dugu Chou at the most conservative estimate. Therefore, our initial assumption was that this cultivation base was the main reason Yun Yang had brought her to the battle. However, if it was only cultivation base, we could have dealt with it by setting up a countermeasure. In fact, we did the same, and the process was even smoother than we'd imagined. However, the final outcome was inconceivably bizarre. If Yun Yang is difficult to deal with, it's still reasonable, but the woman's bizarre backlash is the truly troublesome one. This matter can be said to be a pressing matter, difficult to deal with. Speaking of this, even Mr. Nian wore a worried expression, let alone the others. It was already exceptionally difficult to deal with someone with an unparalleled cultivation base, but she was also unafraid of being injured. It was simply impossible to deal with her. Not only was she unafraid of being injured, but she would also be struck by the backlash. Not only would she be unharmed, but she would also be able to kill the person who struck her. This was practically against the rules. However, this unimaginable, unbelievable, and bizarre situation was the truth. What was even worse was what the bystander had said. What's more frightening is that she is completely unscathed after being struck twice. The person whose neck was slashed and heart was pierced did not die, but the person who struck her was killed by the backlash. This was indeed appalling, but perhaps the other party had used some kind of mysterious art. The effect was immediate once or twice, but in reality, there was still a hindrance. It was just that it was not obvious at the moment. However, the fact that she was completely unharmed shattered this notion. Even if the woman's protective art had its limits and the consequences were far-reaching, could they break the other party's protective art even if everyone on their side were to go all out? Furthermore, what if the other party's art did not have any flaws? What if it was an absolute defense and extreme backlash? Then, there was really no other way. There was no possibility of killing this woman at all. She could not be killed, she could not be evaded, and she could not be beaten. The other party was truly unafraid of fighting, but afraid that they would not fight, afraid that they would not fight. This situation is the most disgusting. It's even more troublesome than Yun Yang. A Four Seasons Tower expert sighed with a contorted expression, deeply lamenting the helplessness of being unable to do anything. Chapter 840. Although Mr. Nian had long guessed that the helper Yun Yang had brought along was suspicious and would greatly affect the Four Seasons Tower, he did not expect it to be so troublesome. What was the concept of a terrifying enemy that could not be killed at all? Moreover, this enemy was the kind of mortal enemy who would not rest until one of them was dead and had a profound cultivation base. If the other party had been a man, Mr. Nian could still try to drive a wedge between them and be driven by profit, but this was a woman, Yun Yang's woman. Moreover, it was the kind of woman who was dead set on Yun Yang. What method could be used to make a woman who was dead set on her man betray him on a battlefield of life and death? Perhaps there was no other way in this world since the beginning of time. Now, we can only use the stupidest method to deal with it. The winter bearer, who was dressed in white, frowned and said dryly, "Split into two and separate the two of them. Brothers on one side, fight Yun Yang with your life and end this as soon as possible. As for the other side, we'll try to trap the woman. It's understandable to fight with your life, but how do we trap the woman? Try. It's easier said than done." Another person asked. The woman's cultivation base is profound and her demonic defensive skill is even more bizarre, but her actual combat experience is still lacking. This is something we can try to apply. The trapping method I'm thinking of is that we won't initiate an attack but will passively take the attack with our advantage of manpower. Our only goal is to prevent this woman from escaping the encirclement. The winter bearer looked bitter as he said, I know this method is too passive, like we're meat on the chopping block, but this is the only targeted tactic I can think of. The woman's counterattack is indeed powerful, but I believe that her proactive attack won't be accompanied by the extreme counterattack. Otherwise, it wouldn't just be 2 people who died just now, but 4 of them. Then we're still not going to be punching bags. Everyone chuckled bitterly. They could not attack and could only be beaten to trap a pinnacle expert, insisting that she would not be able to escape the encirclement. Such a strategy was absurd and utterly unreasonable. However, there was only one way left now. The experts felt extremely aggrieved, but there was nothing they could do. Facing someone who could only be beaten and could not attack, and the other party was a pinnacle expert, it was undoubtedly an extremely dangerous thing. The opponent's counterattack could definitely kill, but could the opponent's attack not kill? Even if they were made of steel, they wouldn't be able to withstand being beaten up like this. When the news of the final battle came, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. They had been fighting Supreme Cloud for so long, both openly and covertly. In fact, even when they were confident that victory was within their grasp, it was inevitable that they were tired and impatient. Now that there was finally a chance to settle the other party once and for all, they could not help but feel tired and impatient. What they had never expected was that when it came, when the time finally came, when they were finally faced with such an awkward situation. What the hell, the brothers had been waiting for so excitedly, just to become human punching bags? Yun Yang's bearer, Heaven, said, Yang, with that summer, bearer, Yang, Yun, Yang, Chen Yang, Yun, was that Yun, was that not, Yang is Yang. Yun, Yun, thousand Yun Yang. Yun Yang was Yang. Everyone's body trembled, and their faces revealed expressions of disbelief, but then they came to a sudden realization. I see. This lady, is the residence of 9 Supremes incarnation? The residence of 9 Supremes has become a person? A woman at that? This is really, unbelievable. Even so, the force of the counterattack is too terrifying. It's inexplicable, it's no wonder the residence of 9 Supremes vanished into thin air, but, how is this possible? Those who had seen Ji Lingxi looked as if they were dreaming, especially those who had seen her before. That slender figure, that pretty face, that head of hair, that alluring willow swaying in the wind, was it actually a house? How could a house turn into a person? You must be King kidding me. If that's the case, this Supreme Cloud has found a house to be his wife. Another person looked incredulous. A house. How does he ck it? This. Another person looked aggrieved. Why do you care how he ket it? The current situation is how we're going to deal with the crushing force of this house, how we're going to trap this house and not be crushed to death by it. I think you're worrying too much. The person frowned and chuckled bitterly. I just feel that this Supreme Cloud's appetite is very strange. Everyone exchanged glances when they heard him. Their strange and aggrieved thoughts should have been filled with melancholy and frustration, but they were strangely tinged with a hint of mirth instead. Mr. Nian sighed and said with a frown, we're already facing a great calamity. I can't believe all of you can still worry about such strange things. You're all King experienced martial artists who have no regard for life or death. He pinched the space between his brows, his head throbbing with a headache. I have a plan. Summer Bearer stood up. The group perked up. What is it? Use heavy weapons, heavy hidden weapons. Leave as soon as you make contact, don't linger. Take turns to ambush him, don't give him any time to rest. Everyone's eyes shone. This sounded like a great idea. Also, rearrange the formation and make the fog thicker. It'll be easier to ambush him. Mr. Nian frowned and pondered carefully. This is a feasible plan, but everyone must remember that you can only strike once and retreat immediately. No one is allowed to linger. Yes. If the other party can't help but pursue us, it'll be our chance to separate the two of them. We'll use the tactic of mutual destruction and end the battle quickly. Even if a few of us die in one go, we must kill Supreme Cloud in the shortest time possible after they're separated. As for the woman, we can ignore her. Kill Supreme Cloud and our mission will be accomplished. Yes. Move at once. Yunyang, who was dressed in purple, moved forward in the thick fog without any attempt to conceal himself. He was at ease, as if he was taking a stroll in his own backyard, no different from his usual carefree self. Yunyang was not putting on an act. There had never been a moment where he felt so clearly how powerful he was. It was a monstrous confidence that he could slay any enemy, no matter how strong they were. Along the way, Yunyang had been cautious and cautious, constantly reminding himself that he was too weak and that he could be killed by the enemy at any time. Chapter 841. It was this sense of vigilance that had risen in his heart countless times that spurred him to not let go of any room for improvement in his cultivation, to move forward with all his might. He tried his best to obtain resources, to cultivate his martial arts skills, to practice his saber skills. Perhaps, it was this constant vigilance that stemmed from this thought that made him use all means to conceal his existence. Along the way, he had used his intelligence to deal with the enemies he encountered to the greatest extent. It was to the extent that he barely had a few direct confrontations with his enemies after such a long period of time. He had kept a low profile for so long. Now that the divine weapon was unsheathed, the world would tremble in fear. This was not him speaking incoherently after achieving his goal, it was a display of his self-worth and absolute confidence. A lifetime of resourcefulness, the mountains fall, he buried himself in refining his divine weapon, he did not speak of the secular world for 3 years, the unsheathing of his treasured saber shocks heaven and earth. Many years later, Supreme Cloud's story spread throughout the world. His experience of hiding his edge during these years was spread to Tianxian along with novels. Wu Ying, who was then the Minister of War and the Grand Commandant of the Board of War, broke his habit of remaining silent for many years and composed a poem while he was drunk. Both of them stood side by side, leaving their names in the annals of history, lasting for generations to come. Beside him was Ji Lingxi, but her expression was more relaxed than Yunyang's. The Four Seasons Tower that had initially weighed on both of their hearts and regarded them as formidable foes was now nothing to be worried about. After the battle just now, their confidence in themselves had skyrocketed to a shocking level. Oh, Tianxian Cliff. Yunyang sighed softly. My brothers are all here. Watching me kill the Four Seasons Tower's men one by one, I can totally feel how happy and comforted they are right now. Ji Lingxi smiled and said, didn't you say that a few of them are still alive? It's not good if they're all here watching us feel happy and comforted. At least, I don't want Big Brother's spirit to be here. I don't want to miss the day when I can reunite with him. Yunyang sighed softly. You've misinterpreted my thoughts. Perhaps we're in different parts of the world now, walking different paths, but have our hearts ever been separated? The emotions I'm feeling now are only from the fact that I haven't seen them appear before me alive. A voice interrupted abruptly, I didn't expect Lord Supreme Cloud to be such a sentimental person. It's a pity that the battlefield is fraught with danger and survival is a matter of life and death. However, if Supreme Cloud really wishes to see them again, it's not a difficult task. As long as this humble one sends Lord Supreme Cloud on a journey, you'll be able to see them right away. There's no need to spend a long time reminiscing about them. Yunyang turned around abruptly and raised his hand. A ray of saber light lashed out like a bolt of lightning. There was a loud dang sound, followed by a shockwave. A long laugh rang out, and the person who spoke quickly retreated. He saw a cold light fly over from another direction. Yun-yang blocked it with his saber. With a loud clang, the divine edge buzzed and an oddly shaped concealed weapon, about half a foot long, fell to the ground. Not only was the concealed weapon unique in shape, the force attached to it was not weak either. Even with Yun-yang's current cultivation base, he was still shaken by the impact. Furthermore, this concealed weapon was only the beginning, or rather, the prelude to a secret weapon baptism. Swoosh, 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 for a moment, all sorts of strange concealed weapons flew in from all directions. The ones who launched the concealed weapons were extremely careful, leaving as soon as they made contact and never staying where they were. Each attack was heavy and forceful, as if they had given it their all. Furthermore, the concealed weapons used by these people were all extremely heavy, none of them less than a caddy. Such heavy concealed weapons were infused with the mystical skill of pinnacle martial artists of this world. The force was simply earth-shattering. Along with this wave of heavy concealed weapons, there were also people who were looking for an opening to attack from the front. The weapons these people used were also different from others. Other than thick iron rods and thick padeos, there were also relatively bulky iron maces and the like. There was even one person who was wielding an incomparably large iron chisel. Most of the weapons used by this wave of attackers were not divine weapons, nor were they weapons that they were proficient in. However, they had one advantage: thick, heavy, hard. This prerequisite ensured that they were sturdy enough to take a beating. Wielding such heavy weapons in addition to the support of mystical qi, even Yun-yang's divine edge would not be able to cut or destroy them so easily. And this kind of attack, every moment, continued, did not stop for a moment, did not stop for a moment, did not stop at all. The attacks were endless. There were at least one or even several attacks in a split second, but the Four Seasons Tower's experts did not actually show themselves. They maintained the core tactic of leaving after a single strike and retreating immediately. Whether it was effective or not, all the attacks were launched without warning. In addition, the attacks were only directed at Yun-yang, not harming Ji Lingxi at all. The clanging sounds were like metal being hammered, ringing incessantly. Yun-yang was focused on dealing with the attacks, unable to care about anything else. He had thought that the Four Seasons Tower's attacks would only last for a while. After all, it was impossible for them to kill him. However, he did not expect the other party to carry on without a break. There seemed to be no stopping at all. Such a stalemate lasted for a whole day before the attacks slowed down slightly, but they were still coming. Yun-yang's heart was as clear as a mirror. So this was the Four Seasons Tower's plan. The other party has attacked you no less than 10,000 times throughout the day. It should be at least this number. Ji Lingxi looked at Yun-yang with worry in her eyes. It looks like they plan to exhaust you to death. Yun-yang's face was flushed, a rare sight. His breathing was labored as well. Even though his cultivation base was unparalleled and he had Emmy's help, he still felt exhausted after withstanding the attacks for an entire day. It was difficult for him to cope with the attacks that had been going on non-stop. The Four Seasons Tower's reputation isn't just built on their overwhelming combat power. It's predictable that they would use targeted attacks when their strategy is not going their way. I think, they might not be limited to such tactics. After all, the cycle of such tactics is too long. I think their ultimate goal is to exhaust my mystical qi as much as possible, and they'll probably have other tactics after that. Yun-yang panted and said, "I'll be tired if I keep fighting like this, but they won't have it easy either. They might be even more tired than I am." Chapter 842. Ji Lingxi said in surprise, "But why do I feel that this is already the best tactic against you?" You basically haven't counterattacked throughout the entire day. Isn't this already an unwinnable position? An unwinnable position can also be an undefeatable position. It's impossible for them to exhaust me to death with such a tactic. Yunyang smiled faintly. Think about it. I stand still and make sure that I don't lose. Although I can't win, I can't lose either. The other party, on the other hand, has to choose which direction to advance and retreat to, and they have to use their full strength in every attack. The energy they expend is a few times more than mine. My current cultivation base is higher than most of them. How can I be exhausted to death? If this tactic could really work, do you think there would be such an opening now? Ji Lingxi smiled. Then why don't you choose to attack first? Although the other party's attacks are intense, there have been a few openings throughout the day. Although those openings were fleeting, they were real. If we had aimed and attacked, it wouldn't be difficult to kill one or two of them. Because if we were to attack first, we would be falling into their trap instead. Yunyang smiled faintly. I can almost be sure that the ultimate goal of their battle today is to make us unable to endure it and attack first. Only then will they have the chance to separate us and defeat us one by one. The other side obviously values you very much, and they're even helpless, which is why they're passively using this completely inefficient tactic. But if their plan succeeds, we'll be split into two, and they won't have to worry about you anymore. They only need to use the strength of a few people to restrain you, and then they can concentrate all their strength to kill me in the shortest amount of time possible. Yunyang smiled faintly. As long as they kill me, they don't even need to care about you anymore. You can just leave. Your existence doesn't affect the overall situation, you can't shake the colossus that is the Four Seasons Tower. Do you understand now? This is the fundamental reason why they're using such an exhausting tactic. Yunyang spoke to Ji Lingxi as he fended off the ever-present attacks. Although he was not at ease, he was still able to handle the situation with ease. Yunyang had spoken openly. He did not intentionally lower his voice, nor did he use telepathy. He had just said it out loud in a straightforward manner. Therefore, not only did Ji Lingxi hear these words clearly, even the experts of the Four Seasons Tower who were hiding in the dark could hear them clearly. This was the Four Seasons Tower's ultimate goal. Yunyang had hit the nail on the head. As Yunyang's speech came to an end, the Four Seasons Tower's attacking rhythm was suddenly disrupted. In the next quarter of an hour, the attacks had completely disappeared. What you said just now wasn't meant for me to hear, was it? Ji Lingxi smiled sweetly. Yunyang chuckled. How is it not for you? I'm answering your deliberate question just now. Ji Lingxi chuckled as well. Of course we have to explain to them. Otherwise, they'll think that they've fallen into their trap. Yunyang said, Mr. Nian's stratagem isn't limited to this. He must have a backup plan. He won't let me get away with it so easily, so I must be more vigilant next. Ji Lingxi nodded. What Yunyang had said earlier had obviously exposed the Four Seasons Tower's wishful thinking. Therefore, there was no further action in the quarter of an hour that followed. However, the rhythm of the attacks that followed was far more explosive than before. It was still the same as before. It had not changed. Instead, it had intensified. Countless heavy weapons rained down on Yunyang like a torrential downpour. Ji Lingxi was rather annoyed. Why was it that after exposing the enemy's plan, not only did they not change their strategy, but they continued to carry it out even more intensely? This was illogical. The Four Seasons Tower's experts continued to exert pressure on the Four Seasons Tower with their frequent attacks. It was to the extent that after someone had muttered something, intentionally or otherwise, they simply turned into countless boulders that came crashing down. The area of attack was much larger than before. Naturally, they could no longer care about avoiding Ji Lingxi. They came crashing down without a care for the consequences or the cost. However, what surprised the Four Seasons Tower's men was that when the boulders hit Lingxi, the boulders did not return to the person who had launched the attack despite being turned into dust from the recoil. It was obvious that the force that the boulders could withstand was too limited and the counterattack was too strong. Before the recoil could be formed, the boulders had already turned into dust. In spite of this, the Four Seasons Tower's men were unprecedentedly elated. They thought that they had found the right way to subdue Lingxi, so every boulder that came crashing down was massive, like a small hill. Super experts like the Four Seasons Tower had infused the boulders with a considerable amount of mystical qi and smashed them down viciously. It was not just one person, there were at least 20 people fighting in the same way at the same time. The combined force of the attack was earth-shattering. In spite of this, the attackers still insisted on not showing themselves, maintaining their initial conservative strategy. After the attack, regardless of whether it was successful or not, they would retreat to their original positions, not giving the enemy a chance to retaliate. Maintain the established strategy and exhaust Supreme Cloud to death. So what if you've seen through the tower leader's scheme? Just because you've seen through it doesn't mean that you can handle it. There are so many of us working together, can't we exhaust Supreme Cloud to death? It had to be said that such a shameless method of fighting had put Yun Yang in a difficult position. Indeed, this was the most effective and targeted way to deal with Yun Yang at the moment. Retreating immediately after the attack, Yun Yang would not be able to do anything to these people, no matter how capable he was. After all, even if it was a face-to-face battle, Yun Yang would need a few strikes to find a chance to finish off one of them, what more when there was a momentary gap in the attacks. The attacking pattern from all directions was the same. As long as he gave chase, even if he succeeded, he would definitely be cut off from Lingxi's coordination. The result was obviously what the Four Seasons Tower had been hoping for. Boom, 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 the endless attacks were relentless. Ranged, close, and high, there was no loophole in the attack. This kind of scene that absolutely should not have appeared in a battle between peak experts, but it continued to play out in an unusually strange way here, one after another. Seeing that the other party's attacks were continuing, Yun Yang and Lingxi could not help changing their strategy as well, taking turns to defend themselves. Each of them would last for a quarter of an hour before switching to another person to fight for some time to catch their breath. After a day, both of them were not injured, but they were covered in dust and their mystical qi was severely depleted. Yet, the other party showed no signs of stopping, as if they planned to continue this single tactic until the end of time. Both of their expressions subconsciously turned grim. Could such a simple tactic really restrain them and cause the previous advantageous situation to be completely gone? If one day, you meet someone who still has misgivings about this and that at the moment of life and death, then you must remember that this person must have a deeper plan. If you can avoid making friends with them, then don't. It's hard to have such a person as a friend or an enemy. It's never easy to survive in Jianghu, and it's even more difficult to achieve hegemony in this kind of environment, to be able to sit firmly on the throne of a region. Lingxi gazed at Yun Yang for a long time before she said softly, "I will remember this. I will never dare to forget it. He's worried that I will be deceived if he's not by my side one day." Thinking of this, Lingxi could not help but feel a sweetness in her heart despite being in such a harsh battlefield. For a moment, her heart was filled with tenderness and sweetness, intoxicating her for a long time. Amidst the sweetness, the stones that were flying around them like a storm seemed to have become adorable as well. So what if my white clothes are stained? The current environment is the perfect place for us to fight side by side, without a third party's interference. I am delighted. Such battles continued unabated. It was dull but extremely dangerous. The rumbling sounds continued for 3 days and 3 nights, never ceasing to be heard. It was as if the world was collapsing and the earth was cracking apart at every moment. Fu Baogua and the others who were stationed 100 miles away felt the constant tremors beneath their feet. They looked at each other in shock and trepidation. They were already so far away, but they were only suffering from the aftermath of the impact. Even with their cultivation base, they still felt like they could not stand. What kind of impact would Supreme Cloud and the others who were in the middle of the battle be enduring? More terrifyingly, how could the battle go on for so long? It had already been 3 days and there was still no sign of it stopping. There was not even a pause in between. It was as if these people who were engaged in battle did not need to rest at all. As expected of the martial world's experts, legends and myths. This endurance alone is enough to impress us. On Tianxian Cliff, Yun Yang was panting heavily, his exhaustion evident. Mr. Nian and the others who were on the other side were not feeling well either. Including Mr. Nian, the remaining 20 experts of the Four Seasons Tower were sweating profusely, their strength lacking. It was obvious that Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi's resilience had far exceeded Mr. Nian and the others' expectations. Huff, huff. The winter bearer panted as if he was about to vomit his guts out. His face was purplish and the mystical qi around him was overflowing, vaguely showing signs of disorder. If this continues, I'm afraid that Supreme Cloud won't be dragged to death by us. Instead, we'll be the ones to die first. At least, I feel like I can't hold on any longer. Right now, my heart feels like it's going to be gasped out of my mouth. My cultivation method is slowly collapsing. If I don't suppress it and adjust my breathing, my qi and cultivation might dissipate at any time and I'll die. The others had their tongues hanging out, unable to speak. They nodded in agreement as they panted heavily. In fact, they were not the only ones who were exhausted. Even Mr. Nian's face was purplish and he could barely speak. Who's organizing the attack now? It's Summer and Autumn are trying their best to hold on, huff, but I don't think they can hold on much longer. Our brothers are exhausted. Maintaining this extreme mode of exhaustion for a long time, huff, no one can last. But Supreme Cloud must be feeling worse. Mr. Nian huffed and puffed. Our strength is far above the other parties. Occasionally, we have time to catch our breath, but the two of them haven't had a chance to rest since the beginning. Even if they were made of steel, they would have collapsed by now. So now, it's just a competition of willpower. Whoever can hold on till the end will be the winner. Chapter 844. Just as everyone was talking, a few figures rolled and crawled over like rolling snowballs. Their heavy panting could be heard clearly even from a distance of more than 100 feet. Translator, Transan editor, Transan summer emissary, who was dressed in red, tumbled down from above. His forehead hit a big rock with a bang. The so-called master's demeanor was completely gone. Fortunately, his head was still harder than the big rock, and the big rock that was hit was broken into pieces. He fell to the ground, motionless. Cough, who? I'm so tired, next wave. He said, panting. As he spoke, white foam began to form from his mouth, along with streaks of blood. It was obvious that not only was he exhausted, but he had also sustained internal injuries. Even a deity would find it hard to withstand such an intense output for a long period of time. Mr. Nian stood up abruptly. Those who can still hold on, follow me. Victory will be ours if we persevere to the end. He led the 8 to 9 people who had just caught their breaths but were still limp as they charged forward, panting heavily. Their attacks were still relentless. Yun Yang. Ji Lingxi's face was purple as she panted heavily. I feel terrible. I don't think I can hold on any longer. Although Yun Yang's condition was slightly better than Ji Lingxi's, it did not look optimistic either. He held Ji Lingxi's hand and said, it's alright, it's alright. Let's hold on a little longer. Now, we're only competing with our willpower. Whoever gives up first will be the loser. Once we give up, we'll lose everything." As he spoke, he transferred Emmy's air of vitality to her without batting an eyelid. With the support of the air of vitality, Ji Lingxi felt waves of relief wash over her, but she was still panting. I feel like I can faint at any time. My vision is blurry." Yun Yang comforted her while panting, "Hold on. Hold on." As he spoke, he suddenly staggered, as if he could no longer stand properly. The Four Seasons Tower's experts who were watching from the shadows could not help but be overjoyed. Their attacks became even more ferocious. These two formidable opponents finally could not hold on any longer. Victory belongs to us. To be honest, the fact that he had persisted until now was enough to earn everyone's admiration. The Four Seasons Tower had arranged for 3 shifts of manpower to ensure a little bit of recovery time. On the other hand, Yun Yang and the girl did not even have the slightest chance to catch their breath. They had been persisting with high intensity. Yun Yang was the top enemy of the Four Seasons Tower. It was understandable that Supreme Cloud, the sole survivor of the 9 Supremes, had such endurance, but this woman was beyond everyone's expectations. One had to know that women were born with weak bodies, and it was difficult for their physiques to be compared to men's. No matter how profound one's cultivation was, it couldn't change the fact that one had an innate physique. It was a miracle that she was able to persist until now. It completely refreshed everyone's understanding of female practitioners. However, when he remembered that this was a house, he felt relieved. Yun Yang's hoarse voice bellowed, "Mr. Nian. Huff, huff, huff. Does the Four Seasons Tower intend to go on like this? Huff. With such a method of fighting, even if all the rocks in Tianxian Cliff were to be thrown here, how many can there be? Isn't such behavior laughable? Since this is the final battle, does the Four Seasons Tower's final battle consist of, huff, huff, throwing rocks?" Yun Yang's voice was hoarse. "Come and fight me fair and square if you have the guts." His voice was intermittent. Everyone could empathize with the extreme exhaustion he was feeling. Everyone shared the same thought, feeling the same emotion. The enemies in the thick fog were all silent. They continued to hurl countless boulders at Yun Yang, the sound of the wind whistling through the air. No matter how much they felt regretful or lamented, they were all veterans of the martial world. They knew the logic of falling short at the last step. No matter how weak Yun Yang was now, he could not relax, not even for a little bit. If they gave Supreme Cloud a chance to catch his breath, everyone would be in for a hard time. Yun Yang was still trying his best to fend off the attacks, growling furiously. Ji Lingxi was beside him, blocking the flying rocks from time to time. She looked like she was exhausted, but the corners of her lips were curled up slightly, almost bursting out in laughter. Ji Lingxi and Yun Yang were tired, of course. They were very tired. However, it was not as exaggerated as they appeared to be. They were exhausted and could not continue. It was not to the extent, it was far from the extent. Yun Yang's Emmy was a super cheat. It was perfect for the current battle. Whenever both of them felt fatigued, Emmy would deliver a gush of refined air of vitality to allow both of them to recover. Throughout the entire battle, Yun Yang had secretly delivered it to Ji Lingxi more than a dozen times. Although Ji Lingxi did not understand the reason or the arcane art, she knew that Yun Yang was not as exhausted as he appeared to be. As a girl and an indirect recipient of the power, she could still maintain her strength and combat prowess. How could Yun Yang, the person directly involved, not be able to hold on? This fellow was obviously deceiving them, toying with his opponent. It was hard for this rascal to act so well. The signs that Yun Yang was nearing the end of his tether were getting more and more obvious. The Four Seasons Tower was, of course, in high spirits. Although they were on the brink of exhaustion as well, victory was right before their eyes. They had to hold on no matter what. In spite of this, it did not matter. Another shift, and yet another shift, from the beginning to the end, the other party maintained that hysterical, lifeless state of an arrow at the end of its flight. It was as if he would stop breathing in the next moment, but he did not stop. He was still breathing, struggling at death's door. He maintained this bleak state of being on the brink of death, persevering to deal with the other party in changing shifts 3 more times. He was still holding on. If a third party with a discerning eye were to witness this, they would have muttered to themselves that something was amiss. It was the same for the Four Seasons Tower. Everyone was exhausted to the point that it was difficult for them to even breathe. Their eyes were rolled back, and a dozen of them were beyond exhausted, convulsing on the ground as they foamed at the mouth. There was even a hint of blood that oozed out from the foams. Other than exhaustion, everyone was basically suffering from injuries of varying degrees. They had gone for a sneak attack, wanting to end the battle as soon as possible, but Yuanyang had taken the opportunity to counterattack. Although none of the 20 men from the Four Seasons Tower had died so far, everyone knew clearly that they were on the brink of death. Some of them would even suffer from mental demons and hallucinations if they were to stop, disrupting their initially stable state of mind. Indeed, their current level of exhaustion had exceeded their limits. No one would be surprised if someone were to fall down and never get up again. Chapter 845. Each time the Four Seasons Tower's rock-throwing attack was executed, they had to expend all of their mystical chi. They would only be swapped out after dozens of times, gaining an extremely short time to catch their breath. Again and again, it was no surprise that there was no pause at all. We're humans too, not made of steel. What's the use of such a short respite? Even those who possessed god bones were exhausted like dead dogs. It was difficult for them to continue. This isn't a battle, it's obviously hard labor. It's not as satisfying as drawing a saber. The group lamented. How can Yuanyang be so insane? No matter how tough he is, he's still made of flesh and blood. We've been through life and death many times, but we still can't take it when faced with such an intense output. How did Yuanyang endure it? He's 10 times more tired than we are. Could it be that our willpower is so much weaker than others? Everyone had the same doubt in their hearts. It was the first time in their lives that they had fought in such a manner, but it was also the first time they had encountered something so bizarre. Most probably, they had encountered one bizarre incident after another in this battle at Tianxian Cliff. It was King exhilarating. Mr. Nian, as a perceptive, intelligent, and wise man, had long been suspicious of everything that was happening before him. The strategy should be correct, but why is this happening? Could it be a trap? Who was Mr. Nian? What kind of organization was the Four Seasons Tower? It was the largest force in the entire Tianxian continent, with unimaginable wealth. It was reasonable for them to possess an abundance of miraculous medicinal pills and life-saving treasures. However, under such an intense attack, Mr. Nian and the rest could not keep up with the recovery rate of their own qi consumption. Otherwise, they would not be in such dire straits. In spite of this, Mr. Nian had a feeling that if Yuanyang were to continue fighting with the 20 of them like this, he could fight until the end of the world. How could this be? There was no reason for this at all. Where did Supreme Cloud get such resources from? If he really had such resources, the 9 Supremes would not have been suppressed so badly by the Four Seasons Tower. This was illogical, or rather, illogical. July. After 3 consecutive attacks, retreat and rest for a while. Recover your qi as soon as possible. Yes. Everyone else, cover me. Just attack normally. Mr. Nian's eyes gleamed with a complicated light. If you really have a backup plan, it's worth it for me to exchange my life for the truth. If you don't, and you're just forcing yourself to hold on, in that case, there was nothing more to say. Qiyu shot out like a bolt of lightning. First, she threw out two extremely heavy dark steel flying daggers with a momentum that could shatter rocks. Then, she grabbed a heaven-piercer halberd that weighed several hundred kilograms. She floated up and soared high into the sky. With a loud bang, she smashed down. This strike far surpassed all the previous attacks, and it had the momentum to surpass the North Sea with the weight of Mount Tai. It was abundant, unstoppable, and difficult to resist. Yunyang flicked the tip of his saber, deflecting the dozens of hidden weapons around him before he infused his mystical qi into the divine edge. With a soft hum, he took on the Fangtian halberd that was like a falling meteor with the heaven-scorching flame technique. Clang! The moment the saber and halberd collided, Yunyang's body sank as if he could not bear the weight. The heaven-piercer halberd that his opponent wielded was too heavy. Even though Yunyang was prepared and did not let his guard down, it was still extremely tiring. Unexpectedly, there was something strange about the heaviness. It was a continuous reinforcement. Was the opponent not going to leave after a single touch? Had he finally changed his strategy? Yunyang felt that something was amiss the moment they came into contact. He quickly retracted his saber and spun, turning into a spinning rainbow. This was not an attempt to evade the enemy's attack with extreme speed. The divine edge in Yunyang's hand had expanded to a length of several feet at the same time. Like a long spear, it charged forward and counterattacked swiftly. Seven Moon's heaven-piercer halberd met Yunyang's attack head-on. Although he still felt as if he had been struck by lightning, the heaven-piercer halberd that was forged from the rare northern cold iron was not destroyed in the clash. With a jolt, it was sent flying. Seven Moon took advantage of the situation and once again squeezed out his mystical qi to the limit. Following the upward momentum, he fell back and the heaven-piercer halberd came crashing down again, attacking Yunyang. Against such a divine weapon, one could not kill it with a sneak attack, so the only choice was to win with brute force. Logically, Seven Moon's timing, control, and choice were perfect. If it were anyone else, it would be difficult for them to do better than him. Today, however, was a day that defied common sense and stood out from the masses. A giant long saber suddenly appeared and flew up at high speed like a startling swan. There was only a split second of time, but the saber was already inches away, threatening to kill him. How could it be so fast? Seven Moon felt chills all over his body at once, his vision darkening. The heaven-piercer halberd was still moving, but it had turned into the most stable form of defense. With the achievement of not being destroyed in a single blow, even if the saber had changed shape, the final result would not be too far off, would it? Seven Moon prayed inwardly. In the next moment, however, a ghastly hell suddenly appeared before Seven Moon's eyes. It was real and real, solidifying before his eyes. It was as if the legendary 18 layers of hell had appeared before his eyes, as clear as day. In the blink of an eye, Qiyue's divine sense was no longer clear. She only felt dazed and confused. In her haze, she felt as if all the enemies she had killed in her life were all gathered here at this moment. Countless vengeful spirits and ghosts filled his vision, charging towards him in unison to claim his life and reap his soul. He could not help but cry out in shock, but he could already feel the chilliness of the saber's edge on his chest. Yunyang looked so tired that he could not even lift his arms, and his movements were no longer the same as before. How could he still have such astonishing speed? This was not right. Seven Moon did not have the time to think further. It was a foregone conclusion that he would be killed, so he retreated instinctively to save his own life. Moreover, the momentum of his retreat was at least several hundred feet. It was a pity that just as he began to retreat and move, a silhouette had already appeared in front of him to stop him. It was a chilling purple, beautiful but filled with death. Seven Moon cried out in horror, obviously wanting to ask for help. It was a pity that it was already an extravagant wish. The other party would not give him the chance. The silhouette flashed again, and they were already inches apart. Seven Moon's eyes met Yun Yang's merciless gaze. After that, he was left with a chilling sensation in his chest, as if an ice cube had suddenly stabbed into his heart. The feeling was inexplicably exhilarating, as if he had been liberated to the very end. The next moment, there seemed to be a similar chill coming from his neck as well. His hands, which had always been steady, suddenly lost all strength. The upper-grade heavenly halberd that could withstand a head-on collision with the blade of heaven's will fell to the ground. The last scene that Seven Moon could see was a headless corpse that had suddenly appeared beneath him. At this moment, his mind was already in a state of chaos. He thought blankly, whose body is this? Why is there no head? Then, he knew nothing else. Chapter 846. The purple robe returned to its original position in the blink of an eye. There was only a trickle of blood dripping from the shiny tip of the saber, like a string of blood-red pearls. It was the last trace of the Four Seasons Tower's 7th month's death. Yun Yang's silhouette was like a phantom, flashing out and returning in a flash. It was a fleeting moment, but the life and death of an expert had been decided in this instant. 7th month's series of attacks had come and gone with Yun Yang before everything had come to an end. 7th month had been too greedy. He had taken advantage of the situation to pursue his opponent, but not only had he failed to unleash his full strength, he had already lost his life. The speed of the attack caused Mr. Nian, who had been watching the battle from the side, to narrow his eyes. His eyes were filled with shock. Even when he was at his peak and had not gone through such a tiring battle, it would have been difficult for him to unleash such a speed of attack. It was even more impossible now that he had been through a series of battles. How had Yun Yang done it? Yun Yang had looked like he was on the brink of death. He was in a weakened state, so tired that he could die at any time. How could he still have such combat power? However, he had sensed his opponent's plan the moment 7th month launched his series of attacks. He had counterattacked immediately and killed his opponent in a split second. Logically speaking, 7th month's series of attacks had been launched. Logically speaking, there was no need to worry about his opponent's counterattack. However, Yun Yang had been able to counterattack so quickly. He had launched a thunderous counterattack right before the attacks had even reached his opponent. What was more frightening was that Yun Yang had managed to get close to his opponent in this short span of time and even had the time to unleash a complete saber technique. In the end, Yun Yang had killed 7th month with a complete saber intent. The visual process was that 7th month's second consecutive attack was about to be unleashed. Yun Yang had stabbed his saber into 7th month's heart and beheaded him, ending his opponent's life. The speed, strength, reflexes, explosive force, and the flawless saber technique that had been showcased, not a single one of them should be something that a person who had been fighting for a long time and was exhausted should be able to display. So Yun Yang had been faking it all along. His so-called exhaustion, and inability to continue were all a facade. Mr. Nian came to a conclusion in an instant. It was a conclusion that was hard to believe but within reason. At this moment, his intestines were about to swell with regret. No wonder he kept feeling that something was wrong. It turned out that the opponent wasn't afraid of the battle of attrition that he had come up with. In fact, from a certain perspective, it was an appropriate battle strategy that played right into the opponent's hands. So it turned out that the moment they were waiting for the enemy to truly exhaust their strength was actually the moment the enemy was looking forward to. Because the enemy was also waiting for the moment they were all exhausted. Mr. Nian and the few who participated in the siege broke out in a cold sweat. They were all old monsters who had lived through millennia of hardships. Even though they were not as intelligent as Mr. Nian, their sense of danger was unmistakable. Everyone had the same thought at the same time: is this the wisdom of the supreme wit? This supreme cloud was simply too cunning. Unknowingly, he had caused them to fall into a trap for so long without them realizing it. What the lady had said seemed to have exposed their initial scheme, but Supreme Cloud had gone along with the flow, setting up a deadly trap that he thought would work for them. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. It was because of those words that they had deduced the opponent's targeted battle strategy and followed it to the end. Little did they know that they had fallen right into the enemy's death trap. Fortunately, it was not too late to realize it. If they had waited until they were exhausted to the point of death, would that not mean that they would not even have the slightest ability to retaliate and could only wait helplessly for death? Mr. Nian came to an even more terrifying conclusion: both Supreme Cloud and Yun Yang must have a qi replenishment method that they did not know or even understand. Only then would they be able to wait so confidently to see them make a fool of themselves. Was this another form of waiting at ease for the enemy to exhaust themselves? Even with Mr. Nian's self-restraint, he could not help but feel a sense of dejection at the thought of this. Since he understood this, there was no need to continue this battle of attrition that would only drag them down. It had to be changed. It had to be done as soon as possible, or else they would be digging their own graves. With Mr. Nian's howl, the Four Seasons Tower's men, who were engaged in a fierce battle and attacking from all four sides, did not slack. They retreated swiftly in the thick fog, vanishing without a trace in an instant. Only a clear, panting voice could be heard coming from the thick fog. "Lord Supreme Cloud, you're indeed worthy of the title of Supreme Wit. Such adaptability and intelligence, you're truly a wise man. It's breathtaking. It's a pity that a moment of recklessness has caused all our efforts to go to waste. I wonder if Lord Supreme Cloud feels that it's a pity." Yun Yang replied faintly, "Killing one person is a reward. What's there to feel pity about? To me, being able to kill one person is worth it. You've gone through so much trouble to set up this targeted killing trap. If I don't play with you for a little longer, how can I repay Mr. Nian's kindness? Since it's consensual, it complements each other." Mr. Nian's voice had long disappeared. It was unknown if he could hear Yun Yang's monologue. Yun Yang listened for a moment after he finished speaking. Then, he pulled Ji Lingxi's hand and both of them flew up soundlessly from the thick fog, heading towards a direction like phantoms. "Let's go. Although they're the ones who created the fog and can be used, it's not like we can't make use of it now. Of course, we won't be able to accurately grasp their movements when they initiate the attack in the thick fog. However, after the switch of offense and defense, it'll be the same for them when we initiate the attack." Actually, Mr. Nian's guess, or rather, everyone's guess, is still wrong. The situation that I've been waiting for has never been the moment when they're completely drained of energy, waiting helplessly for death. Yun Yang's smiling gaze flickered with endless murderous intent. What I've been waiting for is this moment when they discover us. If not, why would I reveal my trump card and break the stalemate? Chapter 847. It won't be so easy to end this war. When they're truly exhausted, they'll definitely go into hiding. It's not even worth thinking about. Besides, they're the ones who set up this place, so they're naturally more familiar with the terrain. By then, we might not be able to track them down quickly. With their capabilities, if they manage to escape, even if it's only a part of them, it'll be enough to cause Yutong a huge loss. Instead, when they realize that we don't mind the exhaustion and realize that the current situation is actually a trap that I've set up and turned into our countermeasure, they'll immediately change their wrong strategy. However, at this time, facing such a huge shock and frustration, when everyone stops attacking and retreats to discuss countermeasures, it'll be the only time in this war when the enemy won't be monitoring our movements. This is also the best time for us to counterattack. What we have to do now is to seize this opportunity. Yun Yang told Ji Lingxi seriously, when we have a trump card in our hands, when we're not afraid of the enemy's scheme, we must let the enemy's scheme be carried out completely, at least half of it. We can't stop when we're deep in it. It's only at such a time that the enemy's confidence will be the greatest blow. It's also the best opportunity to annihilate the enemy. Ji Lingxi hummed in acknowledgement and said, "I'll remember that." At this point, her heart was filled with joy. During this period of time, Yun Yang had been doing this, using all the time and everything he could to impart martial world experience to him. Yun Yang's intention was very obvious. He was afraid that he would be at a disadvantage, especially after he went to the bound of universe. Therefore, he had been teaching her by example and teaching her, nurturing her bit by bit. Once they went to the bound of universe, both of them would have to be separated for a period of time. It was impossible for them to walk the same path. The path to heaven had its own destiny, there would never be a unified path. Yun Yang's patient guidance was obviously because he was afraid that she would not be able to be thorough when she was alone. The thought that came from her lover warmed Ji Lingxi's heart and gave her the urge to cry tears of happiness. What more could she ask for in this life to meet such a great man? Not long after, both of them were already tens of thousands of feet away. The enemy's hiding spot can't be too far away. We're already very close. Yun Yang switched to telepathy and held his breath. Ji Lingxi's actual cultivation base was a notch higher than Yun Yang's. She stopped abruptly and listened attentively, saying, "There's movement up ahead. It seems to be a valley. Is that where the enemy is hiding?" Yun Yang perked up at once when he heard that. The two of them quietly crept over. What? The men of the Four Seasons Tower were sprawled on the ground, panting heavily, their faces as pale as the dead. A few of them were already vomiting blood. Extreme fatigue made one feel as if time had gone haywire, and one's eyes were dazzled. Yet, at this moment, they heard such unfortunate news. Immediately, a few people choked, and their eyes rolled back as they fainted. The others widened their eyes and mouths in disbelief. They were so shocked by the news brought back by Mr. Nian that they almost forgot about their fatigue. Each of them widened their eyes and mouths as they stared at Mr. Nian in a daze. All of them lost their voices on the spot. What the hell? Isn't he afraid of a war of attrition? What the opponent needed was a war of attrition? In this war of attrition, the ones who would be exhausted were us. The opponent could replenish his chi infinitely. The opponent could wait for an opportunity to exhaust himself. If that was the case, were they not a bunch of fools who thought they were smart and exhausted everyone else to death? Moreover, they were fools who had fallen right into the opponent's trap. What was more frightening was that the opponent was not only barely able to fight, but he was also brimming with energy. His combat power had not diminished much. Thinking of this, the men fell into a dejected atmosphere. They had the urge to scream, "Oh my God," and bang their heads against the wall to kill themselves. In reality, the Four Seasons Tower's guesses were greatly off. It was true that Yun Yang could replenish his chi quickly and still had a considerable amount of combat power left, but to say that he was brimming with energy would be overestimating Lord Supreme Cloud. After all, no matter how fast he could replenish his chi, even with Emmy's heaven-defying help, the physical fatigue was still real. Yun Yang was made of flesh and blood after all. The saying that human strength was limited still applied to him. Human strength was not limited to physical strength. Vitality, mental strength, and mental strength were all within the scope of this saying. In such an extreme battle, how could he not be tired? At most, he was only slightly better off compared to the Four Seasons Tower's men. Of course, even if he was only slightly better, the situation was not much better for the Four Seasons Tower. To them, who did not even have a tenth of their combat power, Yun Yang's condition was equally difficult to deal with. Everyone, consume the medicinal pills and move immediately. Mr. Nian ordered without hesitation, this place is no longer safe. If Supreme Cloud comes here now, the situation will take a turn for the worse. It will be unsalvageable. Before his words echoed in the air, a bolt of lightning flashed across the sky like it had been summoned, engulfing the entire place. After the lightning had swept past, the sharp whistling of the wind could be heard. This sudden attack came without any warning, and there was really no room for warning. Yun Yang attacked with all his might. The saber was merciless, the Tao was merciless. Beyond the saber, life and death were but a thought. The river of blood hung upside down, reincarnation under the saber. Saber truth, destiny's blades, 3 styles and 6 styles were unleashed at the same time, converging and pouring out. With all the physical strength that Yun Yang had gathered, he could only perform these 3 styles consecutively despite exerting all his might. He was already out of energy and could not continue. In spite of this, these 3 styles and 6 styles were more than enough. The saber light converged into a mighty torrent, surging into the valley and drowning the 4 Seasons Tower's men. The 4 Seasons Tower's experts, who were already exhausted, were plunged into the most extreme despair. Many of them were limp, especially the few who had just retreated. It was difficult for them to even pick up their weapons. There were also a few who had fainted. Their current state was absolutely the weakest they could be. After all, they had just escaped from danger and felt that they had arrived at a safe place. They could finally heave a sigh of relief. They were at their lowest and most relaxed state of mind. How could they have known that a King Yama would appear out of nowhere at such a time? How could they withstand such a sudden, fatal blow? Chapter 848. Yun Yang had been preparing for this moment for 3 whole days. Yun Yang had put in a lot of effort. First, he had displayed his trump card, the Divine Edge, in all aspects during the battle, so that his opponent would have a great deal of apprehension, so that he would have to find another way to deal with it. This was the first. Then, he had further exposed Ji Lingxi's miraculous recoil force that he should have kept as his trump card, adding another 3 levels of headache to his opponent. He had to think of a way to bypass Ji Lingxi and attack Yun Yang as soon as possible. This was the second. Under such circumstances, Yun Yang had actually left the 4 Seasons Tower's men with 3 choices: to clash with heavy weapons, to ambush with hidden weapons, or to engage in a prolonged battle of attrition. Conversely, they would not be able to evade Yun Yang's saber and Ji Lingxi's recoil force. No matter which of these 3 choices the 4 Seasons Tower chose, Yun Yang would be able to beat them at their own game instantly and lead the situation to the one he had set. Yun Yang gauged the other's heart with his own. After a deeper thought, he made a further deduction: the combination of these 3 modes of attack was the best solution. After all, if he were to be on Mr. Nian's side, he would definitely choose this mode of attack as well. In the end, it was not because the 4 Seasons Tower or Mr. Nian were stupid that they had chosen the 3-in-1 fighting method. It was because this was the only correct way to attack the 2 trump cards that Yun Yang had revealed. There was no other way other than this. If they could not avoid Yun Yang's saber, it was only a matter of time before they died in Yun Yang's hands one after another if they continued to add fuel to the fire or fought in the dark. Even if they attacked Yun Yang, what would they do if Ji Lingxi suddenly pounced on him? This was completely foreseeable, and there was no way to avoid it. Yet, Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi's cultivation base had become extraordinarily high. It was difficult to separate them and defeat them one by one. Therefore, even if Mr. Nian was exceptionally intelligent, this was the only choice they had if they wanted to kill Supreme Cloud in Tianxian Cliff. Moreover, their opponents had been anticipating this battle for years. How could they retreat midway? Furthermore, they would retreat when they had the absolute advantage in numbers? It was absolutely impossible. In the end, the people of the Four Seasons Tower had unknowingly walked into the death trap that Yun Yang had meticulously laid out. Come to think of it, if Yun Yang did not have Emmy as his trump card, the Four Seasons Tower's option would really be the only option that could kill Yun Yang and his team. However, who would have thought that Yun Yang would have Emmy, a heaven-defying cheat that was beyond everyone's knowledge? It had completely turned the situation around, turning the impossible death trap into reality. Ultimately, the key lay in the last step. Could Yun Yang pursue the enemy to their resting camp the moment they knew the truth and retreated, taking advantage of their precarious situation to kill them in one fell swoop? This situation was a result of Yun Yang's ploy. He had endured for 3 days and 3 nights, almost to the point of death, to obtain such an opportunity. How could he let it go so easily? Even Yun Yang himself felt that he might only encounter such an opportunity once in his entire life. Once the other party knew his trump card, he would never make the same mistake again. Therefore, Yun Yang had expended all of his energy in this attack. Saber light filled the sky. Even the extremely thick fog was banished to the side. Cries of agony could be heard wherever the saber light passed. Blood shot into the sky, filling the place with crimson. The Four Seasons Tower's subordinates, the pinnacle experts who stood at the pinnacle of the martial world's cultivators, were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered, unable to resist at all. Ji Lingxi, who was by Yun Yang's side, was merciless with the sword in her hand, swinging it freely. The sword light stretched far and covered the entire valley. Both of them were like two murderous gods, charging forward with an unstoppable momentum. This journey could only be described with one word: unstoppable. At this moment, even Mr. Nian's gaze was filled with despair. In the blink of an eye, heads rolled and broken limbs flew in all directions. The Four Seasons Tower's men were at the lowest point of their lives. How could they be spared from Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi's all-out attack? Many of them were sprawled on the ground, never having the chance to stand up again. It was only when Yun Yang had killed 6 men and Ji Lingxi had killed 5 of the Four Seasons Tower's experts that the killing blow subsided. The 4 men who had returned in the earliest shift and Mr. Nian, who had just returned, worked together to activate their life force and temporarily restrain Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi by fighting with their lives on the line. In spite of this, they had only managed to save 3 men. Mr. Nian mustered his strength to push Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi back a little. Seizing the opportunity, his leg kicked out continuously. He kicked the 3 men who were still lying on the ground, exhausted and barely able to move, far away like kicking a rubber ball. "Run!" he roared hoarsely. Before his words echoed in the air, the long sword in his hand danced and fired several feet long sword energy, trying his best to stop Yun Yang, who was determined to exterminate them. At this moment, the Four Seasons Tower's Supreme Lord no longer had any of his previous elegance. The 4 men who attacked with Mr. Nian were the Autumn Bringer, the Summer Bringer, the Winter Bringer, and a God's Bone Bringer. As for the rest of the Four Seasons Tower's experts, whether they possessed God's Bone or were of ordinary months, they had all perished under Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi's swords and sabers. From the moment Yun Yang and Ji Lingxi launched their ambush, it had only been a dozen breaths' time before a total of 11 people were killed, their souls sent to the underworld. The so-called pinnacle experts of this world had still lost their lives when their sabers moved too quickly. Faced with Yun Yang's determination to detonate his body and activate the divine edge in an extreme manner, they could not withstand the unparalleled sharpness of the divine edge despite possessing God's bone and possessing a physique that was far superior to an ordinary man's. This point had been proven earlier. Now that they were in a state of exhaustion, such an outcome was not unexpected. The blood on the ground had almost formed a small river. The entire valley was covered in a bloody storm. Mr. Nian's eyes were about to split open, filled with rage and hatred. More than half of the god's bone-bringer that the Four Seasons Tower had assembled over thousands of years had been lost. The 4 seasons and 12 moons that had been together for thousands of years were either dead or wounded. To create these core forces of the Four Seasons Tower, countless so-called Four Seasons Towers' venerable lords had been lost in the long river of time. Entry, bone fusion, nourishment, recovery, integration, countless lives had been sacrificed to create the Four Seasons Tower's glory in subduing the world by force. Now, with such a strong foundation, it had gradually become a situation where all of them were going to perish here. At this moment, he even felt a tinge of regret. What if he had ignored the prophecy? He and Heaven's oracle, Gu Chaoyang, were still best friends. They were people who followed the will of heaven. Let the 9 supremes rise. Their original intention was to protect Yutong. When Yutong unified the world, they would gradually come to an end. The Four Seasons Tower would still reign supreme in the martial world. 100 years later, the 9 supremes might not still be in this world. The Four Seasons Tower had waited for thousands of years. Why must they be so eager to wade into this muddy water? Chapter 849. A shrill shriek rang out beside him. Mr. Nian finally saw the so-called recoil for the first time. Summer Envoy had swung his saber too hard, and his strength was not enough to control it as he wished. Finally, the saber had landed on the girl in white. Not only did the girl not evade, she charged forward in the opposite direction, thrusting herself between the Winter and Summer Envoys. She stabbed Winter Envoy viciously, piercing a bloody hole in his shoulder. Then, on her body, a faint red light slowly emerged. Summer Envoy's saber force was like snow that had met the blazing sun. It was extinguished and melted instantly. His body, clad in red, was struck head-on by the red light. With a pained howl, he was flung away, flailing his limbs. Somewhere high up in the sky, pieces of his internal organs were spewing out of his mouth. Looking at the current situation, Mr. Nian knew clearly that Summer Envoy was done for. Summer Envoy's body was already at its limit from the accumulation of overexertion. Now that he was suffering from a recoil, it triggered all the negative effects in his body. There was no way he could be lucky. Sure enough, the next moment, Summer Messenger's body, which was still rising, suddenly disintegrated in the air and turned into ashes that filled the sky, becoming one with the dust of the sky. Go! Mr. Nian bellowed as a signal. At the same time, the sword in his hand glowed with a blinding white light that had never been seen before. With a swift spin in the air, he and his sword morphed into a long dragon that resembled a rolling cylinder. His entire body was resplendent, glimmering with a blinding radiance as he plunged towards Yun Yang. Yun Yang had first unleashed his ultimate skill and then killed a few people consecutively. He was at the end of his tether now. After all, he was not made of steel. The battles that had been going on for a few days had not been faked, and he did not have to protect himself like Ji Lingxi who had the crimson light. Even with Emmy's support, it was inevitable that he would be exhausted. If Mr. Nian were to charge at him with the most extreme form of being one with his sword, Yun Yang could only evade with all his might. Facing the fatal blow of this pinnacle expert, even if Ling Xiaozui and Dugu Chou were to join forces, they would still have to retreat. What was more, Yun Yang who was already at his weakest. Wielding their sword light and saber energy, Mr. Nian and the other 3 men were shrouded in crimson light as they worked together to break through Ji Lingxi and Yun Yang's joint defense. With a long howl of agony, they charged out of the valley. The thick fog stirred. The 3 people from before had already escaped from that direction. The 3 of them had to rush over to meet up. The situation on the Four Seasons Tower's side was extremely dire. If the 6 men from the Four Seasons Tower did not gather together, they would be defeated and killed by Yun Yang and Ling Xian one by one sooner or later. Even if the 6 lucky survivors stayed together, they might not feel any safer. After all, their opponents were too terrifying, and too strange. Indeed, compared to Yun Yang and Dugu Chao's own abilities, the hidden tricks were the key to their defeat. Whether it was Yun Yang's peerless blade, the lady's protective light, or the inexplicable art of infinite qi replenishment, they were all tricks that were beyond common knowledge. How could they not be defeated in the face of such a strange situation? Yun Yang heaved a long sigh of relief when he saw Mr. Nian and the other two men dashing out of the bloody canyon like a bolt of lightning. He plopped down on the ground, perspiration gushing out of his body like a fountain. For a moment, he felt like he had been washed from head to toe. He was so tired that he could only roll his eyes. He actually felt like he couldn't even breathe properly. It was a feeling that made him want to tear his throat open to catch his breath. His vision darkened and the world spun. Lowering his head, he spat out a mouthful of blood. Ji Lingxi's condition was not much better. Her legs gave out as she sat beside him, panting heavily, her pretty face pale. Both of them were at their limits as well. Yun Yang panted and said, "Let's recuperate and recuperate. We have at least a day's rest." "A day?" Ji Lingxi asked. Aren't you afraid that they'll run away?" Yun Yang smiled faintly and said, panting, "They won't be able to run away. Not to mention the fact that they haven't achieved their goal, why would they want to run? Besides, we're already so tired. They'll only be more tired than us, and their condition will be worse. They won't be able to run even if they want to. Before we recover, they won't be able to get up." Yun Yang sucked in a long breath, feeling like his throat was on fire. Even breathing was painful. He chuckled humorlessly and said, "Those who are still alive in this battle have all damaged their origin, except for the two of us." Ji Lingxi said, "Damaged origin is something that can only be sensed and not explained." "How can you tell?" Yun Yang closed his eyes and snorted, saying tiredly, "What you're saying is only under normal circumstances. It's difficult to injure high-level cultivators. Their origin is where their foundation lies. Even if it's damaged, they'll have to try their best to hide it. But now, their condition has hit rock bottom. They've activated their life force's potential to retaliate with all their might. How can their foundation be damaged? Even when they're panting, their breath is red, there's a thick stench of blood. It's a sign that the vitality and potential of one's life have been exhausted to the extreme, but it's hard to disguise it. Don't be fooled by how lively everyone was just now. Once they stop, let me tell you, even if they were lying here right now, lying beside us, they wouldn't have the strength to turn around and hit us. This situation is similar to the Four Seasons Tower's state of being paralyzed on the ground, unable to retaliate. However, the latter's life force foundation isn't too damaged. Now, the former's life force, stamina, mystical qi, as well as mental strength and willpower have all been depleted. It's not something that can be recovered in a short period of time. So, today will be the most reassuring day of this battle. Go to sleep, sleep in peace." He then stuffed a few medicinal pills into Ji Lingxi's mouth and channeled a gust of life force into her. Yun Yang did not have to trouble himself. After all, the energy stored deep within his body had always been supporting him. As long as there was enough room for him to replenish his qi, he would be fine. After panting heavily for a moment, his breathing gradually calmed down. Feeling much better, Yun Yang took out a pot of water. It was only then that he realized that his arm that was holding the pot was trembling. He brought it to Ji Lingxi's mouth to let her drink a few mouthfuls. Ji Lingxi was still gulping down the water a moment ago, but in the next moment, she had already closed her eyes and was snoring softly. The corners of Yun Yang's lips curled up soundlessly. "I'm really stupid. I didn't realize that this lass. She's really tired out these past few days." He brought the pot to his mouth and gulped it down. As he drank, he felt his eyelids fighting. An indescribable sense of exhaustion washed over him like a tsunami, causing him to fall asleep almost without thinking. The pot tipped over and the water splashed all over him, but he could not feel it at all. Two things. Firstly, there's actually no need for me to explain in chapter 537. Some old bookworms will analyze where the trap is on their own, but I've still written it. Because I can't analyze more on my own. Cough. Chapter 850. Yun Yang's current state was not much different from that of the Four Seasons Tower's men who had collapsed on the ground earlier. All of them were exhausted and had entered a deep state of self-recovery. Yun Yang was right. Mr. Nian and the others had used the last of their strength to rush out of the canyon and to the back of Tianxian Cliff, a hiding spot that had long been set up. Almost everyone had fallen in. Once they had stabilized, they were still huffing and puffing blood mist out of their mouths. This went on for quite a while. Mr. Nian had used the last of his strength to set up the formation at the entrance of the cave. Then, unable to continue, he collapsed to the ground and fell into a deep slumber without uttering a single word. No one was surprised because the other five had long fallen into a deep slumber. Their breaths had stabilized, just like that. After experiencing such a heavy loss, they were extremely aggrieved and wronged, but now, they did not even have the strength to scold Yun Yang. In the narrow cave, the six of them squeezed together, snoring ceaselessly one after another. Beneath Tianxian Cliff, Fu Baogua and the others were still looking up, anticipating the outcome. The rumbling that had been going on for 4 days and 4 nights had finally stopped, returning to a deathly silence. However, to the crowd, this deathly silence was even worse than the huge commotion from before. All of their faces were ashen and pale, and they were extremely nervous and filled with worry. The fight is over, isn't it? It should be. Who won then? It must be Lord Supreme Cloud's victory, right? Should we go up to take a look and confirm the situation? Can we? Will it affect Lord Supreme Cloud? Our abilities are weak. We don't want him to be distracted and take care of us. Why don't we wait a little longer? Fu Baogua's mind was in a whirl, feeling extremely conflicted. His usual wisdom and decisiveness were nowhere to be seen. After a moment of contemplation, he said, "If it's over, Lord Supreme Cloud will inform us." How worrisome, somewhere far away. High up in the sky, 2 silhouettes were rushing towards them at lightning speed. Oh no, it's been too long this time. I wonder if I can make it in time. What a pity. Who would have thought that the School of Kismet State's location would be so well hidden, outside the endless sea? Oh no. Little brother, please don't let anything happen to you, please don't. What are you talking about? Hurry up and move faster, in the air, about 2,000 li away from the heavenly cliff. A white-robed figure sped toward Tianxian Cliff at full speed with the speed of lightning. Together with his sword, he was like a bolt of lightning soaring through the sky. In a flash, he had traveled thousands of feet. It was Jun Moyan, whom she had not seen for a long time. Yutong's scattered manpower had finally found him and convinced this peerless swordsman to join the battle at Tianxian Cliff. What moved Jun Moyan was not Yutong's complete annihilation of Zio, but something else, something that no one else knew about Yun Yang and Jun Moyan. So, Yun Yang is Supreme Cloud. So, Supreme Cloud is the child old Dugu mentioned. No wonder Supreme Cloud made such a move in Zilong City back then. I didn't manage to save old Dugu back then. Today, I must save his son. Even if it's the Four Seasons Tower, it's not a guarantee. It was a pity that it was already too late when he received the news. The battle at Tianxian Cliff had already begun more than 10 days ago. Jun Moyan had traveled day and night anxiously. Finally, he was almost there. Seeing that he was close to his destination, he sped up. I hope I can make it in time. I hope there won't be another regret. On Tianxian Cliff. The current situation was enough to make anyone's eyes pop out of their sockets. Two opposing parties, one occupying the front of the mountain while the other occupied the back, were doing the same thing, sleeping soundly. He slept to his heart's content and was extremely satisfied. Where was the battle? I don't know anything about it. This atmosphere was simply too peaceful. Was this the rhythm of preparing for the heavens? 4 hours later, Yun Yang was the first one to wake up. Although he knew that Mr. Nian and the others must be more tired than he was and would not wake up for at least 8 hours, Yun Yang had only reserved 2 hours of sleep for himself. However, what Yun Yang was dissatisfied with was that he had actually overslept. My self-control and self-control are still lacking. I might have to train on this in the future. Any mistake could be fatal. This time's negligence is already too much. Yun Yang was very dissatisfied with his performance. Looking at Ji Lingxi, who was still snoring away, the girl was as exhausted as he was, but she was like a kitten when she fell asleep. Both her hands were placed in front of her face while her body was curled up, unmoving. Her breathing was soft and even. Yun Yang was stunned. He remembered hearing the girl snoring softly before he fell asleep. Why was she not snoring now? Yun Yang, who could not come up with an answer to this question, stood up. Just as he was about to make a move, he heard the bones in his entire body cracking. The sound was abrupt and horrifying. Even Yun Yang felt his teeth aching when he heard it. Moving carefully, he still felt that his bones were limp as if they could break at any time. He tried to circulate his divine sense, but he only felt that his mind was filled with pain, as if it was being pricked by needles, rising and falling without end. The abrupt and continuous agony almost made Yun Yang hold his head and moan. Thankfully, he had experienced more terrifying pain before. He gritted his teeth and endured it for a while before he felt better. Slowly, he extended his deific consciousness to probe his surroundings carefully to confirm the situation. After a round of inspection, he was slightly relieved. Although he had said that nothing would happen within a day, it was mostly to comfort Ji Lingxi and not the truth. How could Yun Yang really think so? How could there be such a good thing in this world? Such a good thing could never be allowed to happen, be it to himself or the Four Seasons Tower. As for Yun Yang, if anything unexpected happened under such circumstances, this nap would become a long slumber and the tables would be turned. As for the other party, how could Yun Yang allow him to have such a long time to catch his breath? If it were not for the fact that he was already at his limit and that he would hurt his foundation if he continued to hold on, Yun Yang would never have let go, much less rest. Yun Yang was already out of helplessness that he could allow himself to sleep for 2 hours. If he did not sleep now, he would either damage his foundation or die of exhaustion. The foggy atmosphere remained the same. Yun Yang did not seize the opportunity to search for Mr. Nian and the others. Firstly, it was not the right time. More haste would not bring success. Secondly, his condition was not right either. His bones were limp and his ability was far from recovering. If he were to look for the other party now, he might end up as food for the other party instead. Everyone was once again on the same level. Their bodies were limp and they could not muster the slightest bit of strength. Even taking a deep breath was tiring. It could be said that it was an awkward situation where both sides were afraid of each other. After another 3 hours, Ji Lingxi finally woke up. With a soft hum, the beauty frowned instinctively. She felt so sore all over that it did not belong to her. Even the slightest movement was difficult. In spite of this, the girl's reaction was extremely strong. She endured it and stood up with great effort. She frowned and gritted her teeth, moving left and right. She cultivated slowly, her brows knitted together, but she did not make a sound. It was only after an hour that she finally spoke. "This is the first time in my life that I'm so tired. How are you? Are you all right?" Yun Yang's gaze was filled with tenderness and an indescribable admiration. The woman in front of him was not only pure and beautiful, but she was also strong and elegant. She was a rare and wonderful person. What more could he ask for when he had such a soulmate? I'm fine. You don't mean what you said. Let me take a look at your injuries. Ji Lingxi stood up and looked at Yun Yang with concern. Her eyes were rimmed with tears. Although Yun Yang had the upper hand in this battle, he had paid a heavy price as well. Towards the end of the battle, Emmy's support was like a drop in the bucket. The wounds on his body could no longer heal quickly. There were 40 to 50 cuts all over his body now, making him look like he was covered in cuts and bruises. Although each of them was only a flesh wound, it was still a ghastly sight to behold and a soul-stirring sight. If it had been an ordinary person, the wounds would have been enough to drain their blood dry. Ji Lingxi carefully treated Yun Yang bit by bit, treating all the wounds on his body without missing a single spot. Yun Yang did not look bloated, nor did he look like he was a burden. Your bandaging technique. Yun Yang was impressed. I'm ashamed of my inferiority. I didn't expect you to have such a marvelous skill. It's amazing. Ji Lingxi smiled proudly and scoffed, saying arrogantly, You call yourself a martial world veteran. Which one of us in the martial world isn't skilled in this little trick? Isn't it normal to be injured in the martial world? That's surprising. There are so many skills that you don't know about me. Yun Yang lifted his head speechlessly. Big sister, you're not humble at all. Actually, the red light protecting you has long repelled all evil. How could there be a chance for you to be injured? You're not embarrassed to say this, but I'll be embarrassed for you. Is there still no news from the Four Seasons Tower? Asked Ji Lingxi. My condition is terrible today, I've written a chapter today. Let's see if I can finish writing this battle tomorrow. Chapter 851. Yun Yang replied faintly, They're most likely at the back of the mountain now, but I didn't go investigate. Why? Ji Lingxi asked. Aren't you afraid that they'll take the chance to escape? You've planned this meticulously, afraid that someone might slip through the net and bring disaster to Yutong. Yun Yang looked at the corpses strewn not far away and smirked. I'll say it again. They'll never escape. Their biggest wish now is still to kill me. Other than that, the gods' bones that the Four Seasons Tower has accumulated for tens of thousands of years are basically placed here. How can they bear to leave? This is a battle to settle our grudges. It has to end here no matter what. One side must be completely annihilated. Before this, it was my hatred that was greater than heaven. That's why I wanted to kill them by any means possible. I even suggested this battle. However, up until now, more than 90% of the Four Seasons Tower's foundation has been destroyed by my hands. 80% of their brothers of thousands of years have died in our hands. I believe that their hatred now is far more intense than mine. As long as they're not cowards, they won't escape. If they still have the intention to avoid the battle, they won't be a problem. There will be others to finish them off afterward. Yun Yang smiled faintly. I'm very comforted at this moment. Because I've finally returned all the pain they've given me. Almost at the same time when Yun Yang woke up, in the cave behind the mountain, Mr. Nian opened his eyes as well. He looked at the top of the cave in a daze. Then, his eyes were dyed with a crimson glow. He was gasping for breath, not because of exhaustion, but because of extreme hatred. Yun. Supremacy. He growled soundlessly, almost spitting blood from his mouth. Turning his head, he looked at the 6 men who were still snoring soundly beside him. Each of them was covered in blood and wounds, it was unbearable to look at them. Each of them was moaning in agony and snoring tiredly at the same time. Mr. Nian's eyes were rimmed red. The Four Seasons Tower. The Four Seasons Tower that had led the martial world for tens of thousands of years, subduing the world by force and dominating Tianxian, was now only left with these few people. Including himself, there were only 7 of them left, and each of them was riddled with injuries. Mr. Nian, who had regained consciousness, panted heavily. The expression in his eyes flickered with uncertainty as he stared at the 6 people who were still sound asleep. Then, he looked at the thick fog outside the cave. He did not speak for a long while. The Four Seasons Tower was finished. This thought, which he thought would never exist, suddenly rose in his heart, causing him to feel as if his heart was being twisted by a knife the moment he thought of it, the pain piercing through his heart. He had spent countless efforts to inherit his predecessor's legacy, the goal he had fought for his entire life, was gone just like that? He panted for a long, long time. His breathing gradually calmed down, but the light in his eyes was extinguishing bit by bit. When it finally stopped, his eyes were filled with silence. He took out a large handful of pills from his space ring and stuffed them all into his mouth. The sun was about to set. It was already dusk. Yun Yang, who had fully recovered, stood on a high spot with his hands behind his back, watching the setting sun from afar. Unlike the Four Seasons Towers, Mr. Nian and the others who had their foundations severely damaged, Yun Yang had expended more of his physical and mental strength. At most, he had sustained some superficial wounds. Even without Emmy's support, with the abundant energy hidden within Yun Yang's body, his condition would improve rapidly after a good night's sleep and a few hours of rest. Although Yun Yang had yet to recover to his peak state, he had more than 70% of his combat power at his disposal. There was no way he would be weakened. Tianxian Cliff was silent. Yun Yang was truly unhurried now, quietly waiting for the person's arrival. He believed that Mr. Nian would definitely come. Suddenly, a long howl came from the back of the mountain. Yun Yang turned slowly towards the direction of the sound. A faint smile hung on his face, but there was an inexplicable murderous intent hidden within the smile. Ji Lingxi, who had been sitting cross-legged, stood up immediately as well. As she looked towards the direction of the sound, her gleaming sword was in her grasp. Other than Yun Yang, everyone else on Tianxian Cliff was an enemy. Naturally, the person who had spoken just now was an enemy as well. Just then, a silhouette materialized on the other side of the thick fog. Mr. Nian's usually elegant voice rang out in a suppressed manner, "Supreme Cloud, where are you?" The fog that shrouded Tianxian Cliff was too thick, so thick that one could not even see their own fingers. Although Mr. Nian was the one who had set up the formation, he was no exception. He could not see anything that was slightly further away. Yun Yang said, "I'm here, waiting for your arrival." Before his words echoed in the air, Mr. Nian's ethereal silhouette was already in front of him, following the sound. Mr. Nian was dressed in green, just as he had been when they first met. He was dressed neatly from head to toe, and even his hair was neat and tidy. There was not a single trace of exhaustion that could be seen on him after a long battle. He looked like he had just returned from a spring outing. There was an indescribable elegance about him, there was no sense of urgency before a great battle. A hint of surprise flashed in Yun Yang's eyes. It was obvious that he had misjudged Mr. Nian's current state of mind. He could not help being more vigilant. Supreme Cloud is Supreme Cloud indeed. You live up to your reputation as Supreme Wit. Mr. Nian sighed softly. The Four Seasons Tower has lost today's battle. Admitting defeat right from the start? What kind of method was this? Yun Yang felt even more perplexed as he said, "I should be comforted that Mr. Nian has admitted defeat personally, but our standpoints are different. We won't rest until one of us is dead. This grudge can't be resolved just by admitting defeat." It was not that Yun Yang was unforgiving, overbearing, and determined to kill all of them. The truth was that there was no room for reconciliation between the two parties. Any method of resolving the deadlock between the two parties was completely ineffective. It could only end with the complete annihilation of one party. Mr. Nian chuckled. Lord Supreme Cloud, you've misunderstood my intention of admitting defeat. Although I've admitted defeat, I'm not using this to end this battle, nor am I going to resign myself to my fate. The battle is inevitable. A debt of blood can only be settled with blood. Lord Supreme Cloud has always known and done so. Naturally, the Four Seasons Tower will not lower our heads to Lord Supreme Cloud in this regard. However, we are of the same mind and we share the same logic. Continue, Yunyang said cautiously. When this battle ends, only one party may walk down Tianxian Cliff. Mr. Nian sucked in a long breath and said, it doesn't matter if it's you or me. What Mr. Nian means is that the battle still has to go on and that admitting defeat has nothing to do with the grand scheme. Yunyang frowned. If this reputed one were to say that the grudge ends here, would Lord Supreme Cloud agree? Mr. Nian sneered. Of course, that's impossible. Letting the tiger return to the mountain has never been my character. Yunyang's eyes were filled with deep hatred and fear. Putting aside the fact that he had yet to exact his revenge, he knew that he could not bear the consequences of keeping these people alive. Chapter 852. In Tiantang City, none of Yunyang's friends and family could be this man's opponent. If he was able to escape from this battle, he would kill everyone related to him in the future, and there would be no chance of him getting away with it. What was more, the entire empire of Yutong might even crumble under this person's counterattack. Yunyang had never doubted Mr. Nian's intelligence and ability. They were the cream of the crop, the best in the world. Perhaps, compared to Ling Xiaozue and Du Guju, the unrivaled expert of the previous 2 generations, Mr. Nian was the true unrivaled expert. Since Lord Supreme Cloud's intention is to eliminate the root of the problem, why ask me if I'm going to fight or not? Isn't it an unnecessary question? Mr. Nian's eyes were gleaming with deep hatred. To me, even if Lord Supreme Cloud is willing to stop now and turn hostility into friendship, it's impossible. He pointed and said through gritted teeth, the blood feud of Supreme Cloud's brothers has always haunted us, but today, the corpses of our Four Seasons Tower brothers are still lying in the wilderness. Their blood hasn't dried yet, their eyes are still on me. If I don't avenge this, how can I continue to lead the Four Seasons Tower? Yunyang said faintly, what do you intend to do by coming here now? Issue a challenge? Or perhaps you're here to tell me this. The martial world's battles are fought to the death. This is a matter of course, there's nothing wrong with it. Being killed because one is weaker than the other is the ultimate fate of martial artists. There's nothing much to say. Mr. Nian said, but, so many years of brothers. He paused for a moment, and his voice was somewhat choked with emotion. However, he immediately restrained himself, raised his head, looked at the sky, and said unhurriedly, after several springs and autumns, after several storms, thinking back on the years, these brothers of mine, the one who has spent the least time with me has already been with me for 1,200 years, among them, the Four Seasons messenger and I first met, it was more than 3,000 years ago. Now, they've died in battle, but I'm still alive. Perhaps I'll die soon, too, but as long as there's someone from the Four Seasons Tower still alive, I won't allow my brothers' corpses to be left lying in the wilderness. Yunyang was hit with a sudden realization. You're here to collect their corpses? Let them die in peace? Mr. Nian said darkly, that's right. Since we are brothers, I have to collect their corpses no matter what. Besides, I have to take back the god's bone. God's bone. Yunyang pondered with a frown, a thought suddenly appearing in his mind. Mr. Nian said in a low voice, I will bury them as soon as possible. Tomorrow at dawn, you and I shall fight to the death and end this war once and for all. He chuckled forlornly, I don't think Lord Supreme Cloud will be so stingy as to not give me this little time, will you? Yunyang said faintly, you can still bury them today, but I wonder who will bury you when you die here in the future? Mr. Nian smiled and said, I believe that Lord Supreme Cloud will not leave my corpse lying in the wilderness. Yunyang was silent for a moment. However, from a rational point of view, his instincts told him that he could not allow Mr. Nian to retrieve the corpses. A cultivator's instinct for danger reminded him that doing so would put him in grave danger. In spite of this, Mr. Nian's request was fair and reasonable. It was hard to refuse. Even when the two armies were at war and would not rest until one side was dead, the corpses of the other side's warriors should be left for the other side to collect. The dead were the most important. Burying them in peace was human nature since the beginning of time. It was also the most basic rule in this world. Ji Lingxi looked at Yunyang, who had sunk into silence, in confusion. To her, this was not a big deal. The enemy's request to collect the corpses of the deceased before the final battle was a very reasonable thing to do. After all, they had thousands of years of friendship. Why was Yunyang hesitating? He had never been a heartless person. Yunyang was silent for a moment before he said, Sir Nian's request is reasonable and reasonable. Before the battle of life and death, you have to first complete the funeral arrangements of your deceased brothers. I am impressed as well. However, regarding your request, I have a condition as well. The glint in Mr. Nian's eyes flickered as he asked, May I ask what the condition is? Yunyang said slowly, I want to keep a few pieces of God's bones from the deceased. I believe Sir Nian won't mind. Mr. Nian lifted his head abruptly and looked at Yunyang. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Lord Supreme Cloud's condition is reasonable according to common sense. They died in Supreme Cloud's hands, so all their belongings should be Supreme Cloud's spoils of war. There's nothing wrong with that. However, God's bones being embedded in the body isn't simply embedding. It's completely connected to the flesh and blood. If Supreme Cloud were to keep a few pieces, how would that be any different from desecrating the corpses of the deceased? Besides, God's bones are unique to the Four Seasons Tower. They shouldn't have anything to do with you, Lord Supreme Cloud. Why are you making things difficult for me, Lord Supreme Cloud? Yunyang said, I'm only saying this out of curiosity. I just want to see what's so special about God's bones. The battle has ended just now, and the corpses are already lying by the side. I actually forgot to collect them. I don't know if this is a mistake or the will of heaven. He was saying this to tell Mr. Nian clearly, if I really wanted them, I would have collected them all before you came. Mr. Nian was silent for a moment before he said, if Lord Supreme Cloud insists on collecting them, then please collect a few pieces yourself. I'll leave them with you for now. After tomorrow's battle and I'm unfortunately defeated, all the gods' bones in this tower will be yours. On the other hand, if the one who dies in tomorrow's battle is Lord Supreme Cloud, then the tower's belongings will be returned to their rightful owners. Yunyang smiled and said, You're open-minded, Mr. Nian. I admire you even more now. Yunyang had stated his condition and Mr. Nian had agreed to it. Although Yunyang did not know the true intention behind Mr. Nian's act of collecting the corpses, at least Yunyang had successfully interfered. However, once Yunyang thought of himself retrieving the gods' bones from the corpses later, he felt uncomfortable and disgusted. Just like what Mr. Nian had said, how was this different from desecrating the dead? It was not something that could be covered up by saying that they had different standpoints and the spoils of war. Perhaps the Four Seasons Tower could do something like this without any burden, but Yunyang could not do it when it was his turn. This was probably the difference between a hero and a ruthless man. Mr. Nian did not delay. He began to collect the corpses, storing them into his spatial ring one by one. It was obvious that Mr. Nian did not plan to bury them here. He wanted to find another place to bury them properly. Of course, he had to collect all the gods' bones from the corpses before he buried them. This was another important point of the operation. Mr. Nian understood this, and so did Yun Yang. Chapter 853. Realization dawned on Yun Yang. It was true that the fog obscured one's divine sense, but Mr. Nian must have some other way of sensing God's bones. The fog was not an obstacle at all. It seemed that there was indeed something fishy about God's bones. In the end, Mr. Nian left the 3 corpses behind. He stood up and looked at Yun Yang, saying faintly, "If Lord Supreme Cloud doesn't change your mind and wishes to collect a few pieces of God's bones to study, you can do it now. I hope that Lord Supreme Cloud will reconsider when you do so." He smiled rather bleakly and said, "Although the Four Seasons Tower's process of collecting God's bones is inevitably bloody and damaging to the corpses of the deceased, we still have some sense of propriety. I hope that Lord Supreme Cloud can empathize with the dignity of the deceased." Yun Yang nodded and forced a smile. Of course. In all fairness, Yun Yang was still very reluctant to let Mr. Nian collect these corpses and God's bones successfully. Yun Yang's cultivator instincts told him that his decision was not appropriate, and that it was extremely dangerous. The intuition was obvious and unusually real. In spite of this, Yun Yang could not think of any reason to stop this. After all, be it from the perspective of justice, martial world rules, or folklore, he should not be so daring. His subordinates were already dead and his leader had come to collect the corpses regardless of the risk. How could he stop him? Could he be so inhumane? Would he rather watch the dead become a pile of minced meat? If he really had such intentions, what kind of mentality would he have? Was he still human? Dead, dead. Once he was impermanent, everything would be over. No matter how great the grudge was, it would be settled. If word of this got out, his reputation would be tarnished. If he wanted revenge, he could, it was a matter of course, but he had already killed them. What else did he want? Did he have to grind the bones and scatter the ashes to vent his hatred? This was too much. However, Yun Yang was certain that something was amiss. With Mr. Nian's character, even if he had genuine sincerity in risking his life to collect his subordinates' corpses, there must be another reason. That reason might even be the main reason for his actions this time. Despite his worries, he could not really go and collect God's bones. Your enemies are all dead, and only their corpses are left, but you still want to dig out a bone from their corpses. Yun Yang frowned and held an urgent discussion with Emmy. "Emmy, I feel that something is amiss about this. What do you think?" Emmy was very disdainful of Yun Yang's reaction. Anyone with a discerning eye could tell that there was a problem with just one look. Was there even a need to say it? Was there a need to ask? "Master, you're getting dumber and dumber. This kind of person just has to be called supreme wit. How is that reasonable?" Now is not the time to worry about this, okay? I'm asking you how you can prevent it. Emmy was at its wit's end as well. Emmy honestly did not know much about the conspiracies of the human world. If even the supreme wit was helpless, what could it, a plant that was not even a human, do? Yun Yang frowned, his mind racing as he racked his brains. Mr. Nian stood with his arms in his sleeves, his malicious gaze trained on Yun Yang. Naturally, he could see that Yun Yang was filled with doubts and even knew what Yun Yang was worried about. However, he was never worried that Yun Yang would not agree to it from the beginning. No matter how one looked at it, this was an extremely valid reason. As long as it was not someone who was evil and treacherous, a normal person would not stop it. Not only was Yun Yang not an ordinary person, but he was also a famous hero, a legend. How could he leave behind a flaw in his life and sully his past achievements in the ultimate battle of this world? Does Lord Supreme Cloud still have any concerns? Mr. Nian asked coldly, if so, why don't you make it clear as soon as possible? We're enemies to begin with. No matter what Lord Supreme Cloud does, it's only right. Ever since we found out about Lord Supreme Cloud's true identity, the Four Seasons Tower's people have been reminiscing about you besides being amazed. Lord Supreme Cloud seems to have God's bones with you since a long time ago. Mr. Nian's eyes glinted with a cold glint. Isn't the God's bones left behind by snow, frost, sword, and ice all in your possession? Has Lord Supreme Cloud not had enough fun? He continued, if that's the case, Lord Supreme Cloud, just tell me how many pieces you want. Mr. Nian's words went further and further, the sarcasm becoming more and more obvious. However, Yun Yang's eyes, which were lowered in contemplation, suddenly shone. God's bones of snow, frost, sword, and ice? That's right, how could I have forgotten about this? Weren't those pieces of God's bones in my possession back then? Emmy, where are the 4 pieces of God's bones? Asked Yun Yang. He remembered that after snow, frost, sword, and ice had passed the God's bones to him, Emmy had absorbed a large portion of their energy on the spot. Emmy was dumbfounded. Ayaya, Yun Yang's heart skipped a beat. What's wrong? He prayed inwardly, have you eaten them all? I don't want to, at least leave some for me. Emmy was like a child who had made a mistake. Its leaves drooped while its roots moved a little, digging out 4 pieces of bones from the soil. Yun Yang glanced over, his deific consciousness blurring at once. He almost fainted. The 4 pieces of God's bones, which were originally shiny like priceless treasures in his memory, were now pitch black. Their surfaces were covered with small corroded holes, they were so dirty that their original elegance could no longer be seen. The corners of Yun Yang's lips twitched. He lifted his head to look at Emmy speechlessly. Are these God's bones? Ah. Ayaya. Emmy's leaves drooped, its long roots quivering. Is there any way to recover them? I need to study it. Ah. Ayaya, Yun Yang was disappointed. Is the process irreversible? I mean, is there any way to, temporarily recover them? Ayaya, Ayaya, Ayaya. Emmy perked up upon hearing Yun Yang's words and began a long speech. Is it possible? Yun Yang could not help perking up as well. He did not have much of an idea at first. Emmy felt that it could make up for its mistake, so it waved its arms and legs as it explained, going on a long speech after a long speech. Inject your energy into the God's bones and make them look like they were before. You can control the energy remotely and take it away at any time. The so-called aura on the God's bones is essentially a higher level of air of vitality. You can replicate it perfectly without any difference. So awesome. Yun Yang was relieved. Then what are you waiting for? Get to work. Chapter 854. The conversation between Yun Yang and Emmy was a long one, but no matter how lengthy it was, it had actually happened in the blink of an eye. In spite of this, Mr. Nian was thoroughly impatient. He spoke in a booming voice, Yun Yang, Lord Supreme Cloud, what do you want? Just spit it out. You're so hesitant. Are you not going to let me collect the remains of my fallen brothers? How can such an action be the act of a hero? Is the legend of Supreme Cloud only limited to this? Yun Yang laughed and said, why are you so impatient, Mr. Nian? I was just hesitating whether I should really take 2 more pieces of God's bones to study. I do know that placing the bones of God into a human body can indeed enhance one's power. Such an unheard of miracle is not a child's play. That's why I hesitated for so long. In the end, I still feel that this is inappropriate. Let alone the act of a hero, it shouldn't be done just from the word human. Mr. Nian looked at Yun Yang suspiciously. What do you mean by this? Could it be that this brat actually had another ulterior motive? Why did he suddenly change his mind? Supreme wit scheming had been deeply rooted in Mr. Nian's heart when he set up a trap and was used instead. He still had lingering fears and was constantly worried. Death is the most important thing. Yun Yang, will never do something like desecrating the bodies of the dead. Yun Yang said righteously, there's no need to waste any more time on this matter. Sir, please collect your brother's remains and leave quickly. Mr. Nian was still staring at Yun Yang suspiciously. He could clearly feel that Yun Yang was now like a different person from before. He could vaguely sense that this child must be up to no good and that he was plotting something. Perhaps, he had another ulterior motive, but he had no choice but to proceed with his original plan now that the situation had developed to this point. Lord Supreme Cloud, why are you suddenly so kind? Mr. Nian could not help asking in confusion. Yun Yang pretended to look embarrassed and murmured, as I said, the gods' bones left behind by sword, frost, snow, and ice are indeed with me. Humans have a natural fear of the unknown, and it is the same for me. If I return them to you, it will be greatly disadvantageous to me. But today is the final battle between us, so I might as well return the 4 pieces of God's bone to you as well, to make it complete. Mr. Nian was taken aback when he heard that. Instinctively, he asked, are you that kind? Yun Yang was displeased and said, Sir, why do you say this? I am not happy to hear it. I, Yun Yang, am known as Supreme Cloud. I've always been open and aboveboard. When have I ever done anything despicable? When have you ever lied to anyone? Even in the face of enemies, it's all laid out clearly, and life and death are clearly defined. Yun Yang spoke loudly and passionately, even if the 4 Seasons Tower and I are on the same side and will not rest until one of us is dead, I ask myself that all of you have no right to see me, Yun Yang, as a villain. Mr. Nian was at a loss for words. Deep down, he was in agreement and found it hard to refute. Indeed. Yutong's Supreme Cloud was a hero revered by the universe. Even those who wanted Yun Yang dead the most in this world had to admit that Supreme Cloud was a hero of this world, a living legend. Mr. Nian narrowed his eyes and said, even when a hero confronts his enemy, he often resorts to extreme measures. It's understandable that our standpoints are different. Yun Yang said coldly, I hate everyone in the 4 Seasons Tower. This is the truth. However, putting aside our standpoints, the 4 Seasons Tower's men are worthy of my respect. Not just any organization's men can be so unyielding and stubborn that they would rather die than surrender. Shouldn't such an enemy be respected? The 4 Seasons Tower has always lived up to its name as the top organization in this world. That's why I'm doing this today, to give as much as I can. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. This is how I feel, there's no need to talk nonsense. After that, Yun Yang retrieved 4 pieces of God's bone from his spatial ring and said coldly, these are the 4 pieces of God's bone that sword, snow, frost, and ice have given me. I've always been a man of my word. I'll never go back on it. Since I said that I'll return the God's bone, I'll return it now. Tomorrow's final battle will be complete. You're the 4 Seasons Tower's leader. I'm sure you know more about God's bone than I do. I don't care to take advantage of you. It doesn't matter if you want it or not. This is it. The 4 pieces of God's bone that were as clear as jade were tossed onto the ground by Yun Yang like they were old shoes, still glowing brilliantly. Once the 4 pieces of God's bone left Yun Yang's grasp, they shone brilliantly. The 3 energies of ice, frost, and snow surrounded the sharp sword energy. The aura of the 4 gods' bone converged and soared into the sky. A piece of tibia, a piece of neck bone, a piece of spine, and a piece of chest rib. They were the gods' bone left behind by snow, ice, frost, and sword, snow, and ice. Yun Yang tossed the god's bone and smirked, turning to leave. Tomorrow morning, I'll wait for you at the entrance of the Temple of Nine Supremes. When the time comes, we'll fight to the death. The winner has no regrets, the loser has no regrets. That's it, that's all." Having said that, Yunyang held Ji Lingxi's hand and turned to leave with a smirk, never looking back. Mr. Nian wanted to say something, but he did not. He stared at the 4 pieces of God's bone on the ground in a daze, lost in thought. Mr. Nian had been dealing with God's bone for almost his entire life. How could he not recognize the aura of God's bone? The 4 pieces of God's bone that Yunyang had tossed aside were all well nourished. The sword energy, snow energy, frost energy, and ice energy on them were exceptionally rich. They were even more perfect than the ones on the 4 Seasons Tower's God's envoys. They shimmered brilliantly on the ground, mesmerizing anyone who laid eyes on them. Mr. Nian hesitated when he saw the spiritual items before him. To take them or not to take them? The current situation was more or less the same as before. Previously, Yunyang had determined that there was something fishy about Mr. Nian's act of collecting the corpses and God's bone, but he could hardly find a reason to stop him. After all, it was illogical. Now, it was Yunyang who had generously given away the 4 pieces of God's bone that looked so good. The surprise was too much, there must be a reason behind it. How could he just give them to Mr. Nian just like that? Mr. Nian asked himself. If he were in Yunyang's shoes, how could he give them up so easily after spending so much effort to nourish the God's bone? Was he going to give them up? However, these 4 pieces of God's bone did not seem to have any problem at all. Were they really going to give up on such perfect pieces of God's bone just because of his slight suspicion? For a moment, Mr. Nian was in a dilemma. He had never thought that he would be faced with such a dilemma one day, even with his composure. He walked over slowly and picked up a piece of God's bone from the ground. Holding it in his hand, he studied it carefully, examining it from top to bottom. There was no mistake. There was no mistake at all. This was God's bone in its most perfect state. What he held in his hand was Venerable Lord Ice's God's bone. Chapter 855. Mr. Nian slowly injected his mystical qi into them. He watched as God's bones glowed even more brilliantly due to the injection of mystical qi, slowly turning into a chilling aura. As the mystical qi continued to be injected, a layer of frost formed on the ground around them. The surrounding temperature dropped rapidly to freezing point and seemed like it would continue to drop. Mr. Nian turned the God's bones towards the sun and observed them again. He injected mystical qi once more to confirm the condition of the bones. Then, he scraped them a few times with his short sword and finally started a fire. He placed the bones on the fire for a while. After repeated attempts, he concluded that these were the real God's bones. There was nothing fake about them. They were real. However, he was still worried. He placed the 4 pieces of God's bones on the ground and ignored them for now. He then collected the 3 corpses on the ground and mumbled to himself, "There must be an ulterior motive. As long as I resist the temptation and don't take them, all his tricks are destined to be futile. Yes, this is the best choice." As he spoke, he turned and left, vanishing into the thick fog instantly. He left without hesitation. The 4 pieces of God's bones were placed on the ground just like that, as if they had been abandoned by both parties without hesitation. A full 2 hours passed just like that. There was a movement in the thick fog. Mr. Nian's silhouette appeared at the edge once more. He muttered to himself suspiciously, "This seems like there's nothing much to say, however, there's nothing wrong with these 4 pieces of God's bones. Even the connection between them is fine. These are God's bones, perfectly nourished God's bones." Mr. Nian stared at them in confusion. What's Yunyang's intention in doing this? Where is his scheme? He thought about it for a long time but could not figure it out. Slowly, his eyes brightened. Yes, yes. I see. Back then, saber, sword, snow, frost, and ice were specially selected for 5 people with unique talents. Yunyang must have made a wrong judgment when he saw that the 4 Seasons Tower's God's Bone messengers didn't use the characteristics of saber, sword, snow, frost, and ice. His intention in returning these God Bones to me that have been nurtured to perfection must be, for me to use these 4 God Bones in an extremely short amount of time, to give them to the God Bone emissary. Even if a simple implantation of God's bones can be effective in a short period of time, it must be accompanied by flaws. There's no human body that can suddenly withstand the God's bones that have been nurtured so perfectly and have such a special constitution. In particular, he already has considerable experience in dealing with sword, snow, frost, and ice. Even if there's an accident, he can deal with it calmly. However, when one suddenly withstands the special God Bone, there will definitely be some flaws. As long as there is even the slightest flaw, it will be hard to avoid being caught by him, and that will be the end of instant death. Even if we end up abandoning the 4 pieces of God's bones because of our suspicions, we will definitely feel that it is a pity. If the battle turns out to be disadvantageous to us, there will definitely be people who will regret it. Once regret arises in one's heart, one's state of mind will fluctuate, and some flaws and mistakes that shouldn't exist will follow. And this kind of flaw or mistake can easily be fatal. Yunyang's intention of gifting God's bone must not be beyond these 2 reasons. It's no wonder, what he said makes sense. His actions have always been open and aboveboard. Just like before, when he used himself as bait and beat them at their own game, isn't that also an open and aboveboard plot? And now, this is also an open scheme? Leaving the God's bone here just like that, yet making us feel uncomfortable just by looking at it. What a great scheme indeed. Mr. Nian snorted, a cruel glint glinting in his eyes as he murmured, "It's a pity that your efforts will only be a gift to me. Because you'll never know the purpose of my collection of God's bone. You'll only end up in self-destruction." He glided out and with a flick of his sleeves, he kept the 4 pieces of God's bone on the ground. With a smirk, he turned to leave. "Supreme Cloud, I've seen through your open scheme. What are you going to do? If you knew that the 4 pieces of God's bone you've gifted me would cost you your own life, I wonder how you would feel?" Ha ha ha. Smiling, Mr. Nian strode away. "Supreme Cloud, you'll be in for a shock tomorrow morning. You're not the only one who possesses trump cards that are beyond the knowledge of this world's cultivators." With a flash of thick fog, Mr. Nian finally disappeared. Another 4 hours passed. Yunyang appeared in the air and stared at the scene. When he saw that the God's bone had indeed been taken away by Mr. Nian, he could not help grinning. Ji Lingxi followed him excitedly, craning her head to look around. She giggled and said, "The God's bone. Was it taken by Mr. Nian?" Yunyang nodded. "Then, this fellow must be suffering because of you this time, right?" Ji Lingxi chuckled as she spoke telepathically. Yunyang glared at her and said unhappily, "Am I the kind of person who specializes in digging holes for others?" Ji Lingxi stuck her tongue out. "Aren't you?" Yunyang was speechless. He took the lead and said, "Let's go. We can have a good night's rest. I'm sure nothing will happen tonight. Are you confident about tomorrow morning's battle? He's taken all the God's bone. He must have other plans. Isn't what you're doing too risky?" Ji Lingxi asked worriedly. "Even you know that he must have ulterior motives for taking the God's bone, but I still gave them all to him openly and righteously." Yunyang sighed slowly. "People like me are too foolish. I'm a little too insistent on my principles." Sigh. "Blarg," Ji Lingxi retched and suddenly said angrily, "What do you mean by that? What do you mean, even I know? Am I that foolish in your eyes?" Yunyang chuckled and did not answer, walking away leisurely. Ji Lingxi chuckled and did not answer, leaving leisurely. When Mr. Nian returned, the Four Seasons Tower's men were still asleep. Mr. Nian looked at the Four Seasons Tower's men, hesitation written all over his face. If we fight with our current strength tomorrow, the current Supreme Cloud and that woman will definitely lose. Moreover, these people are severely injured now, their roots damaged. It's still unknown if they can be of help tomorrow. However, if we do that, we can turn defeat into victory. His gaze was hesitant and extremely complicated. One moment it was sorrowful, the next, it was vicious and malevolent. It was indescribably menacing, but then, it would turn gloomy again. For a long time, he could not make up his mind. How many years has it been since I've been in such an indecisive situation? Could it be that my heart has really softened after all these years? At this moment, one of them slowly woke up. With a cough, he spat out a mouthful of blood. Amidst the crimson blood, there were pieces of internal organs. He stared at the blood that he had spat out in despair and said weakly, "Boss, for tomorrow's battle, this young brother. I'm afraid, sigh." Mr. Nian's eyes were also on the blood on the ground as he murmured, "Everything, has me." His eyes glinted, turning immeasurably cold. He had made up his mind at this very moment. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.